wishes to the court to review.
I do, Your Honor, and we'll mark them and then.
Mark them all as a deposit next to number.
Your Honor, for the record, while we were out, the state went upstairs and grabbed a copy of our external hard drive that had the phone extractions on them. We opened that extraction. It was dated April the 30th. It included Bennett Germany's cell phone. We found the messages that Ms. Todd showed the court are in fact on that external hard drive found within the phone extraction that was turned over to them on June the 4th. Ms. Todd is currently in the process. She initially told me she did not have Cellbrite on that file. I showed her on her jump drive where she had it, and she's currently in the process of opening up Bennett Germany's cell phone extraction that was produced on June the 4th.
Your Honor, I have it open right now if I can respond.
All right.
Okay.
Hold on, time out. Where's the stuff you wanted to mark for ID? Is there any further response from the state?
Well, Your Honor, the fact that the witness took the stand already.
Okay. So let's finish up the response.
Yeah, Your Honor.
Again, motion, response, reply, I rule. Okay?
Yes, sir. Your Honor, they were provided the information. This witness has taken the stand already. He could have been asked anything that they wanted to about these text messages. Their motion was that it was exculpatory and that it wasn't turned over. In fact, it was turned over. Your Honor, that I don't know any other way to say that they have it.
Okay. All right. You see. Reply by the defense.
Yes, Your Honor. If you'll recall at our hearing on June 4th of 2023, which I have a transcript of, at that day this court told the defense the state to provide all discovery to the state by 5 o'clock that day. The court then asked me if I, in fact, on page 66 of that transcript, the court says, Ms. Todd, do you have an external hard drive you can turn over to the state? And I said, yes, Your Honor, I do. And it said, you owe that to them by 4 o'clock today. And at that point, Your Honor, I did provide an external hard drive to the state before 4 p.m. that day. The state, I think Catherine was just a little mistaken when she said the state gave me these files in digital on the thumb drive. They weren't on the thumb drive. They were on a hard drive, and on the hard drive it contained specific screenshots from March 19th with Bennett, and then in a different section of it, it contained like a summary on the external hard drive of like sort of looks like this of text messages. They're not in chronological order. There doesn't really even seem to be a date order, but I did type in one of the words from Bennett's text message that I gave you on March 28th, which was zoned out, and it's not pulling anything up.
Your permission to assist her?
Do you know how to use the Cellbrite extraction? Do you know how to use the Cellbrite tool, Ms. Todd?
Yes, Your Honor.
So you've looked for it in the reader.
Yes, in fact, it even says here, select the current words, and when Ms. Newman typed it in on her computer, she typed in zone, and it pulled up that particular text message, but it's not pulling it up on this one.
Or maybe assist her and see if it's in fact on her copy.
Sure.
It's there, Your Honor.
Did you find it, Ms. Todd?
Yes, Your Honor, I did provide it.
So you did in fact receive it.
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. Ms. Todd, I'm going to say this. When you accuse a prosecutor of a Brady violation, if she had in fact committed a Brady violation, it should be terminated. That's a very serious allegation. Now, As far as Brady versus Maryland, this is the court's ruling. First, the court finds that the defendant did receive it. As such, there is no Brady violation. Second of all, the first prong is that the state possessed evidence favorable to the defendant, including impeachment evidence. In fact, what I've read in this does contain impeachment evidence, but it impeaches Mr. Bennett Germany and your client. This talks about drug usage back to November of 2023, when their testimony is she didn't begin using drugs in any form till January. Second, that the defendant does not possess the evidence, nor could she obtain it with any reasonable diligence. As this court, in fact, the defendant did have it, and obtaining it with any reasonable diligence, as I recall, Mr. Bennett Germany testified that he was her best friend and that he got on a bike and rode several miles to come see her on the day she said she needed help. I think Mr. Bennett Germany has been more than available to Mr. Gregg. Third prong is that the prosecution suppressed the favorable evidence. In fact, they turned it over. And finally, that had the evidence been disclosed to the defense, a reasonable probability exists that the outcome of the proceedings would have been different. If I'm being frank, this reads more like she has some crush on some boy named Anthony, and there's a talk of a whole bunch of use of taking drugs and sleeping pills. I don't see where that would create a reasonable probability of a different outcome. And finally, the court would note that the state has no duty to search out and discover all possible exculpatory evidence. For those reasons, the motion to dismiss the case for a Brady violation will be denied. All right. I'll give these back to the court reporter. All right, anything further from the state before we bring in the jury?
No, sir.
From the defense?
No, Your Honor.
All right, Brady. Restroom. Go. State, get its next witness on the front row, please. Oh, he was already here. I'm sorry. All right, thank y'all for bearing with me. I apologize, that was my fault, but I think we're ready to proceed now, okay? State may call its next witness.
State calls Dr. Jason Pickett.
directly into it. Make sure you speak loud enough that lady on the back row can hear you, okay?
Yes, sir.
You understand you're down under oath, your answers are sworn answers under penalty of perjury.
I do, Your Honor.
All right, you may proceed.
Dr. Pickett, if you would introduce yourself, please.
Hey, my name is Jason Pickett, Pickett. I am a board-certified psychiatrist. I am a board-certified emergency physician and a board-certified forensic psychiatrist.
So I want to break that down one at a time. Tell us about you are a board-certified psychiatrist, what that means.
That means I did a residency in psychiatry. I did it at the University of Virginia, and I treat patients with mental illness, anxiety, depression, OCD, PTSD. I work at the North Mississippi State Hospital where I see patients who've been committed to the state hospital. Most of my patients have a serious mental illness, which is typically schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, schizoaffective disorder, things like that.
As a emergency medicine physician, can you describe for us what that is?
Yes, as an emergency physician, I work in the emergency department and I treat emergencies. So stroke, heart attack, car wrecks, psychosis, acute, altered mental state. Patients are brought in by police, paramedics, family, so whatever can walk in the front door.
And we heard from Dr. Gugliano earlier about what a forensic psychologist does, but what is it that a forensic psychiatrist does?
So a forensic psychiatrist, we do a lot of the things that a forensic psychologist does, but we also have the expert experience from residency dealing with and prescribing medications. So we're better qualified to consider medications and how they may benefit or harm somebody related to, in a forensic realm, it's related to maybe a crime or competency to stand trial, sanity at the time of their mental state at the time of the offense, and such. So
I want to talk about, kind of back up before you got your certification and talk about if you could give us the benefit of your educational history.
Yes, so I went to Mississippi College and have a bachelor's from there, a master's degree from there. Then I went to the University of Mississippi Medical Center for medical school. Then I stayed at the University of Mississippi Medical Center where I did a 3-year emergency medicine residency, completed that, and immediately after finishing that I went to Virginia and started a second residency in psychiatry. Completed that, worked as an emergency physician throughout that training, periodically here and there as much as I could. And then I did a 1-year fellowship after completing the psychiatry residency in forensic psychiatry where I stayed in Virginia. And that included 2 days a week I would go to the state hospital in Virginia where I would see patients pertaining to competency and sanity. And then 2 days I was at the ILPPP, it's the Institute of Law, Psychiatry, and Public Policy, where there's a lot of forensic psychologists and we work on forensic cases together. And then 1 day a week I would go down to the women's prison and see patients there as typically a general psychiatrist, but it's in a correctional setting. So.
And when you're doing this fellowship, you're actually already licensed to practice medicine.
Yeah, to some degree. I have my MD. You get that when you graduate medical school. So I had that throughout my ER residency and my psychiatry residency and my forensic fellowship. And I was moonlighting as an ER doctor while I'm doing the second residency and fellowship just to pay some bills. But so yeah, I was able to practice medicine throughout all that.
Do you have to take a test or get any kind of certification before you can be a forensic psychiatrist?
Yes, you have to do a 1-year fellowship, which you have to apply for. In the state of Virginia, they only take one applicant a year, and fortunately I was blessed enough to receive that position, which was an honor, and I was very thankful for my training there. Then after completing that, you have to take a board certification, which is expensive and takes a lot of time and money, but I did it and passed, and I'm happy.
And where is it that you're licensed?
We would accept him as I think they're wanting to have him as an expert in general psychiatry, forensic psychiatry, and emergency
Medicine.
medicine. We don't object to that.
All right, he'll be admitted as an expert in the area of general psychiatry, forensic psychiatry, and emergency medicine. You can continue with your questioning about the witness's qualifications if you wish.
No, sir. No need for that. Dr. Pickett, have you? I do want to ask about this. Prior to being involved in this case, have you had the opportunity to perform mental evaluations of defendants?
Yes. In my fellowship, I had on the forensic unit at the state hospital. By definition, with the forensics, most of them had some kind of criminal or some kind of crime related to their mental health. And so I would evaluate their competency to stand trial to see, do they understand? Do they meet all the qualifications and such? So yes.
And we heard Dr. Gugliano talk about there's a list of, in the state of Mississippi, of forensic either psychologists or psychiatrists that are certified to perform these types of evaluations through the Department of Health. Do you know, are you one of those?
Yes, I am.
And how many forensic psychiatrists are there in the state of Mississippi that have gone through the qualification to perform the mental evaluations through the Department of Health?
I don't know how many have gone through the process, because you do have to apply and go through those credentials. They, in my opinion, would be qualified if they wanted to do the process. I don't know how many did the process, but there's only about, I think, 6 in the state of Mississippi. And as far as forensic psychiatrists go, not all of them are practicing, and many of the forensic psychologists are actually out of state. Some of them are out of state that we have, and the list is not very long.
When you are asked to do, in your previous evaluations, when you're asked to determine whether somebody is either mentally competent or insane for trial purposes, who usually hires you, or who are you doing that on behalf of?
To date, I'd say 99% has been the defense. This is my first case being retained for the prosecution. But I do want to make it clear that I remember when we first talked, regardless of whoever brings me into the case, my opinion is my own, and I take great pride and responsibility in that. And regardless of who gets me involved, I let them know from the beginning that my report may fall on your side or it may not, and that's that.
And when you were retained by the state, we agreed to that, right?
We did.
Can you explain, and I know you were present for Dr. Clark's testimony and that you were in the courtroom for Dr. Gugliano's testimony, but I just want to make sure that we're talking about the same insanity standard. Can you describe for the ladies and gentlemen what the McNaughton standard is in the state of Mississippi?
Sure. So the McNaughton standard for insanity, it does vary from state to state. In Mississippi, it is named after Daniel McNaughton, a guy in 1843 who he thought he was killing the prime minister, and he actually killed like a secretary, and he was found insane. And so at that time they came up with a law, again this was 1843 I believe, where you have to have a threshold mental illness just to consider insanity. If you want to move forward, you have to have at least a mental illness. Once you have that mental illness, that's like your ticket. That's like you cannot pass go without that ticket. So you get that diagnosis, and then we can consider the other prongs of this standard. And for McNaughton, it is, did the individual understand the nature and the quality of what they were doing at the time of the offense? That's one. The next one is, did the individual understand the wrongfulness of what they were doing? And so you may have a mental illness, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, PTSD, whatever it is, but that does not equal insanity. by the McNaughton standard. You have to meet the other prongs.
I want to talk about those prongs, Dr. Pickett. You said to know the nature and quality of the acts you were doing. Can you kind of break that down and explain that for us?
Yeah. So, nature, to understand is, from my understanding, is a relatively low bar. It's a knowledge. You know what you're doing. It's a fact-based knowledge. An appreciation, in my opinion, would be a higher standard of you. I think, as Dr. Gugliano testified to earlier, you would also understand the social implications and the ramifications. It's a higher standard. But in Mississippi, according to the Mississippi Rules 12 of Criminal Procedures, which talks about the standard and such, there's simply an understanding. Did this individual know what they were doing? Did they understand the nature? For example, understanding the nature. Let's say somebody is really psychotic, they are out of their mind, they are squeezing a lemon, or they think they're squeezing a lemon, and they're squeezing, and then in reality, instead of squeezing a lemon, they're choking somebody to death. They would not, in that instance, understand or have an appreciation or an understanding of the nature and quality of what they're doing. They think they're squeezing a lemon, when in reality, they're choking somebody to death. Or, so that's basically that.
And as far as the second part of that prong, did they know right from wrong? Did they know wrongfulness? I think we all kind of are taught as children right from wrong, but can you describe for us in a legal sense what that means?
Yes, so in Mississippi, the second prong is, did they know, have an understanding of the wrongfulness of their acts? And in Mississippi, it's a legal wrongfulness, just simply knowing that it's illegal, not even necessarily morally wrong. In other states, it's a moral, like, yes, I know it's illegal to do that, but it might not be morally wrong. I have to, let's say, yes, I know murder is illegal, but I have to kill this alien to save America. So they wouldn't understand the nature because they're psychotic and delusional, and they wouldn't understand the wrongfulness morally because they think it's an alien and they have to kill this alien to save America. So morally, they might not think that was wrong in that example. But in the state of Mississippi, it's simply a knowing legally that it is wrong.
And so just to clarify, even if they didn't morally know it was wrong to kill that alien, they thought it was an alien, in Mississippi, you still don't get to insanity.
Correct.
In this particular case, who was the defendant?
Miss Carly Gregg.
And did you have the opportunity to interview Miss Carly Gregg?
I did.
What other information, let me take a step back, Dr. Pickett, I apologize. Did you perform an evaluation and prepare a report in this case?
I did.
And did you render opinions regarding Carly Gregg in that report?
I did. I met with Miss Carly Gregg on August 30th for about 4.5 hours here with Attorney Todd, and I rendered a decision that was based on my interview with Carly, my extensive review of a lot of discovery, my training, education, experience, and knowledge. I pulled on all of that to surmise a opinion.
And was that opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty?
Yes, it was.
And the items that you're talking about that you reviewed, the interview with the defendant, the mountain of discovery, talks with my office. Did you also talk with Ms. Todd?
Yes, to some degree. I talked to her, I think, mostly during the evaluation and occasionally via email correspondence.
In relying on those things, is that something that a similar situated forensic psychiatrist would rely upon in rendering his opinions?
Yes.
So I want to talk to you about, well, I want to talk to you first. Let's talk about what your opinion is regarding Carly Gregg's sanity, and then I want to back up to how we got there.
Okay.
So what was your ultimate opinion as to whether or not Carly Gregg was insane at the time of the murder, attempted murder, and tampering with physical evidence on March the 19th, 2024?
I'm happy to discuss my opinion, but I do want to say the ultimate opinion is for the fact finders to decide, and I would just offer my opinion. So I do not want to speak to the ultimate decision, but I just want to lay out my opinion based on everything that I have researched and written and read and done. So my opinion is that Carly does not meet Mississippi's standard for insanity at the time of the offense, and that she knew the nature, quality, and wrongfulness of her actions during that day.
So, Dr. Pickett, I want to take you back to the things that you reviewed. You talked about a mountain of discovery. We've seen in the courtroom, we've seen some videos from that day. Did you have the opportunity to review those?
Yes, I did.
Did you consider those in rendering your opinion?
Yes. When you say those, I've seen the garage video footage. I've seen the Wise video camera footage from the dining room. I've seen body camera from the officers. I reviewed several of those. So I have seen a lot of video.
I want to take you back to your interview of Carly Gregg. When did you say that happened?
August 30th of 2024.
And who was present during that interview?
Me, Attorney Todd, and Miss Carly Gregg.
In your practice, is it common for a attorney or a defense attorney to be present during your evaluation?
It's not common. Most of the time I do my evaluations for the defense, and so most of the time they don't come, and they know that I'm there most of the time. But no, they can be there. It's not standard that they are, but they can, and it's not a problem if they are.
In this particular case, in your report, you noted that Ms. Todd was present, but there was something that stood out to you about the participation in this evaluation. Can you tell the ladies and gentlemen about that?
Yes. So at the beginning of the evaluation, Attorney Todd told me that, hey, there's some things that Carly doesn't like to talk about, so I will have to prompt her. And I told her, that's fine, especially in adolescence and a 15-year-old. When I see patients outside here, parents are often involved. That's not unheard of. They have to prompt them. That's totally okay. As the evaluation went on, though, it seemed to be significantly more than just simple prompting. It seemed to become very leading questions, close-ended questions, interjecting particular things and redirecting the conversation at specific times. And in my report, which is 85 pages, I do list examples of this, and I can go through that if that's desired. But it did seem excessive, and it seemed like I was being led somewhere in some of the examples.
And what was your, what was your opinion as to why you were being led?
I really don't want to speculate as to why a defense attorney might, interject so much. It did seem calculated to me, and like there may be some secondary gain in trying to fool me into believing something. In my experience, most of the time when patients are experiencing these things, they do not really need a lot of prompting. Most of the time, if they're suffering with severe mental illness, auditory hallucinations, these scary dissociative spells, they will volunteer that information usually and be able to tell me very vividly and without prompting what they're suffering with.
And just to be clear, Dr. Pickett, it was not your intention to pick on Attorney Todd, right?
No.
You simply noted that in your report because you found it unusual.
Yes.
I want to talk to you about, during your evaluation and your review of the discovery materials, did you ever find any evidence of drug use by Carly?
Yes. There's a lot of mention from her friends, and which, I try not to put too much weight into that because that can be hearsay, opinion, text messages here and there about substances, but there was a lot of it, which made me think there could be more involved here with substances. And it seems like that was the trigger or the impetus for the conversation on the 19th between her and her mother. So I do think substance abuse is relevant.
Did you also review the results of a drug screen of Ms. Gregg?
I did.
Could you tell us what a little bit about that?
Yes. There was a drug screen that was obtained, I believe, at the juvenile center after she was detained, and it tested positive for cannabinoids.
Did you have the opportunity to review the vital core records also?
I got some records from Region 8 afterwards. I did not get the vital records afterwards. Only it may have been in discovery, but by that time I think I had already written my report, and what was in the records, medical records, mental health records after the fact, to me is highly skeptical. And so I don't necessarily put a lot of weight on what was said after the fact, given the very large suspected secondary gain.
Dr. Pickett, if there were another drug screen in the vital core records that showed the presence of marijuana, what would that indicate to you?
It would indicate that she had used marijuana at some point in the recent history of that drug test.
I want to talk to you about some of the other things, Dr. Pickett, that you relied on in your evaluation of Carly Gregg. May I approach the witness room?
Yes. Show it to counsel officer. It's not happening.
I'm giving you what's previously been marked as Defendant's Exhibit 11, and it does not appear these pages are numbered, so I just kind of want to go through them in order.
Okay.
Does that look like something that you reviewed previously?
Yes.
If you could, tell the ladies and gentlemen, what's on the very first page of one of the journals and or sketchbooks or scratch pads from Ms. Gregg's room?
It says water, fire, earth, air. Water, fire, earth, air. Water, fire, earth, air. Fire is circled, and it says, I choose fire. It is powerful, beautiful, and deadly. These are the traits I desire, so I choose fire! Exclamation mark.
And did you consider that whenever you were rendering your ultimate opinion?
I take everything into consideration that I have, that I can. When I look at this in these journals, there's a lot of things in these journals. And I took the time to look through them, and some of them are concerning. Some of them, I question the truthfulness of it. Is it more theatrical? Is it truthful? I think it's hard to know, but I try to use my judgment as I'm reading it in the context. This one seems to me that she writes down in her journal that she desires powerful, beautiful, and deadly.
What were some of the other journal entries that stood out to you, Dr. Pickett?
Can I look at my report, please?
Sure.
Okay. So one of the journals, I think this is the Brown journal, it says in the beginning.
If he's going to refer back, can I know, and you just tell us what page he's referring to?
This would be, this says entry January, it would be the first, I think it's the first one on January 2023, 2024, the Brown.
Yeah, if you can tell me what page.
You didn't base it.
They're not bait stamped. That's what I said. It's hard to tell because they're not bait stamped.
No, I think weren't you saying
Approach. Y'all approach. What page? Page 20. He's on page 20 of his report.
Page 20, under the subsection.
Regarding Carly's journal.
If you would proceed, Dr. Pickett.
Okay, thank you. So it says in the first entry of this journal, I know one of y'all is going to read this eventually, which I guess I have no control over. So to me, the very first entry of this journal, she acknowledges that there's going to be an audience. Somebody's going to read this journal, and she suggests that she has no control over that. And so as I think about that, I ask myself, is this a personal journal where somebody puts things that they are really trying to keep secret? Or is this a budding, articulate author that describes things for theatrical reasons? And so as I go on, there's other things that make me say that. For instance, she talks about various movie reviews. One of them was Pinocchio, the still life. It's a new one that came out, and she talks about her favorite scenes were when the bomb was dropped on the church that killed Carlo. Mussolini, and Mussolini, he's like, he was an imperialist that was associated with Hitler, believed in xenophobia and imperialism, and so I believe signed a pact with Hitler at some point. And so her favorite parts of the movie were the war crimes, Carlo getting killed, and then there's other things where she talks about Harley Quinn, which is some of this stuff is childish, but it shows us into her mind. And so she's right, Harley Quinn is the Joker's girlfriend, and she's crazed and psychotic and does these violent crimes. Then one instance in her journal, there's a little pin mark where she says, it looks like you just poked the paper. And then she writes beside it, look what I did right here. I stabbed my journal like it was Tom Riddle's. Tom Riddle is from Harry Potter series, and he turns into Lord Voldemort, and he's evil. And so in her journal, she talked about Harley Quinn, war crimes, Tom Riddle. There was another page where I can find where she says, what do I believe? And she writes these tenets down, and one of them says, it's okay to be evil. There is no God. And if I can have a minute, can find others.
Judge, may I approach? Exhibit, I'll show you.
Yeah. So this one in the journal also, what do I believe? There is no God, heaven and hell are fake, love is important, you don't need family, writing your own destiny with a check mark beside it, loving yourself, having friends is important, don't belong to anything, never be alone, go to your place of comfort often, sometimes you must blend in, but never forget it's okay to be evil, sometimes you must jump into the dark to truly see the light, privacy is not loneliness, death is inevitable.
Were there other portions of the journal that you found concerning?
Another part where she talks about her reported auditory hallucinations, she says on March 12th, 2024, this is on page 21 in my report, she mentions enjoying books about crazy people. And then she adds that she had a psychotic break, but calls the incident quite silly. And she goes on to say, I actually spoke with one of the voices in my head. Well, I didn't hear them until earlier today, but only then. My particular friends and I were practically screaming bloodthirstily and ravenously. Thank God physical confrontation was not fruitively possible. I sound crazy. And then she continues on. In other sections of her journal, she talks about all the dishonesty.
The dishonesty with what, Dr. Pickett?
I believe she was referencing to after the iPod that she was using as a burner phone had been found in early January, she wrote in her journal at some point, I'm kind of relieved, thanks, because of all the dishonesty. I'm glad it's just over with, so to speak, was my impression. So there were a lot of things. Yes, sir. There were also text messages that I had seen between her and friends that were concerning. When I'm trying to understand somebody's psychiatric mental state, all of this is important. Text messages with friends, conversations with friends, parents, what's going on at school, what's going on at home, drug use, medical history, psychiatric history, all of this is important. And so there's a lot of detail here. And so as I was looking through text messages, one of them she says to, this is on page 22, she's talking to Thad on February 7th, 2024. And she says, you don't understand how fucking psycho I was that day. I almost murdered my parents. And so as I am preparing to come and evaluate her, given the context of what's going on, I take extreme time to go through the mountain of text messages between teenagers, diaries, journals. Some of it seems theatrical and to almost entertain a would-be reader. And some of it is very concerning.
Dr. Pickett, were there also some, I want to come back to the text messages in just a minute, were there also some notes that you looked at of Carly's about gaslighting?
There was a folder that was found, and it goes into a lot of detail about emotional manipulation and gaslighting. And it says at the top, emotional manipulation, gaslighting, and it would define kind of what that is and the setup and how you set this up, how you do it, and then, at the end of it, it signs off with a valediction that says, take advantage, happy hurting.
There were also, I guess, what had been labeled as a dream journal. Do you remember looking through anything where she described some of her dreams?
I do remember one of her writings where she talks about her dreams and kind of leaves the reader with like a cliffhanger of, I had something along the lines, I'm paraphrasing, of I had a really good dream last night. I hope I have another one tonight. Should I write my dreams down? In other words, to like share them with whoever might read it in the future.
Do you recall also seeing Dr. Pickett something where she said back in April in one of her notebooks, I have depression and anger issues, but no one gives a shit?
Yeah, I think she used the word rage.
And before I move on, I think there was another one. There was actually something that was produced in Discovery, and you were present when Dr. Clark testified. It was like a piece of paper that was in green, like a green marker handwriting. As your understanding, and from the testimony yesterday from Dr. Clark, that Carly denied ever writing that or knowing who wrote that. Is that right?
I don't know that I asked her specifically about that page during our evaluation.
Have you reviewed his report?
I have.
And he asked her about that.
He did?
And then,
Oh, I believe he did.
when you were present when he testified yesterday
Yes.
about that.
Yes.
What did Carly say in one of her journals or notebooks about innocence?
There was a quote in one of the areas that said, let me see if I can find it. I think I'm on page 46. It says, life's greatest illusion, innocence.
So, Dr. Pickett, you talked about some of the text messages that you reviewed. Were those messages from the day of the incident, March the 19th, 2024?
Yes. Some of them were. I reviewed text messages for a long time, various people. But yes, I did review text messages from the time, very close to the time of the offense.
So I want to walk you through that. So the messages that you reviewed, can you kind of tell the ladies and gentlemen about why that was important in rendering your ultimate opinion?
Yes. So the text messages at the time of the offense are a window into her mind at that time. And having her words that close to the time of the offense is a pretty good window into her mind and what she was thinking and how she was doing at that time, in my opinion.
And I asked Dr. Gugliano, I believe you're present in the courtroom, it's not very common that we actually have like medical records from a defendant the day before they commit a violent crime, is it?
In experience, I'll have medical records related to somebody who's had a crime, but having somebody do a exam the day before is pretty unusual, rare, not the typical norm. If I have that, I'm very thankful for it.
I want to talk, when we get to your what you relied upon on the day of the incident, I want to talk a little bit more about the text messages and things too. I want to call your attention to something in your report where you talked about that Carly's responses seemed almost textbook perfect. Tell us what you meant by that.
Well, when I would ask her to tell me about some of her reported dissociative spells, she would give me the cliche answer of, well, I just felt like I was outside my body, like I was right here. She kind of did that hand motion like that and said, it's like a dream, like I was just watching myself. And that was another example was when we were talking about racing thoughts. I asked her to, can you elaborate on that? Tell me more about your racing thoughts. I think she said it's like the ocean. And sometimes from experience, people who may not actually have a diagnosis will have trouble going beyond the simple textbook cliche answers. Whereas when I see people who legitimately suffer from schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or even I've seen a few rare that actually had a dissociative disorder. It is rare. They usually can vividly describe these things to me, and oftentimes I see them objectively. They can't hide it. Sometimes they don't even have insight into it. And when somebody comes to me at the state hospital, I mean, it's hard to give a impression of racing thoughts, but these patients, they go from 0 to 100 and their thoughts are one after another, boom, 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 boom. And they may or may not connect, and their pressured speech, it's hard to get them to stop. It's very obvious when they're to that degree. If they're psychotic, it's even more obvious. In my opinion, you don't have to be a psychiatrist to recognize some of these things. Their cousin or their mother or their brother will say, Johnny's not doing good, doc, and they'll drop him off in the ER or they'll drop him off at the state hospital. Well, they'll get committed and come to the state hospital, but it'll be very obvious.
Dr. Pickett, at some point in your report, you talked about the DSM-5 TR. And we heard Dr. Clark talk a little bit about the DSM-5 yesterday. Can you tell us what the difference in the 5 and the TR is?
Every few years, the American Psychiatric Association councils get together and revise, do a text revision, so they update the DSM-5 criteria with various things and criteria. And so every few years there'll be a new revision come out, and the DSM-5 TR is the latest version and the one that I depended on while I rendered my opinion.
Part of your report talks about Carly's thought process, that it was linear, logical, I think reality-based and goal-directed. Could you explain to us what you mean by that?
So linear, as a psychiatrist, our physical exam is a lot of observation. Kind of start at the head, eye contact, their blink rate, are they slow? Their speech rate, their speech content. We get into their thought content, their thought process. Is it linear, A, B, C, D? Ideas seem to connect, or is it, very disorganized and they don't connect? And so linear means we're having a conversation, it's going from A to B, and they connect. Logical means it's reasonable and it's real. It makes sense. You understand. Reality-based it's not delusional. So somebody that I see at the state hospital who's psychotic, they may come in with delusions and they'll say, the FBI's after me, and I know it because I saw a gas can at the gas station and I knew that gas can was a sign that the FBI's following me. Or they'll come in and they'll talk about revelations and the black horses and the white horses and the orange horses and the 6-point stars. I mean, it is very disorganized. It's hard to give you an example, but when you see it, it's pretty obvious.
We've heard testimony, Dr. Clark described a manic state and a hypomanic state. During the course of your evaluation with Carly, did it ever appear that she was having any sort of manic state?
Not during my exam, certainly not.
In your review of the medical afterwards, did it ever appear that Carly had reported any type of manic state?
No. I reviewed, I think the therapy notes started with Annette Bryant back in 2015. At least those were the oldest that I had to look at. I looked through those, did not see any mention of dissociation, no mention of auditory hallucinations, no mention of mania or hypomania. So that was from 2015 to 2019. Then I reviewed the LPC Kirk, the counselor, her charts from January of 2024 through March of 2024, the day before the event. There was no mention of auditory hallucinations, dissociative spells, hypomania or mania, or disorganized thoughts, or anything consistent with psychosis. And then I reviewed the mental health nurse practitioner Lieber. I read all of her notes, January, February, March, and none of those mentioned it either. I also found some medical records from UMMC. I think she would have been about 11 years old. There's a Dr. Vaughn and another doctor. Those were well child visits, but you know, a lot of times, commonly, if a general practitioner recognizes that somebody has bipolar or schizophrenia or whatever, they'll put it in there, and I didn't see anything in those either.
I want to come back to the talk about disassociation, but I want to talk a little bit about Dr. Clark said that Mr. Gregg, Carly's dad, had been diagnosed with bipolar. Did you see medical records that had him listed as a diagnosis of bipolar?
I saw very sparse records that listed him as bipolar.
Based on your training and experience, if someone also suffers from a substance abuse addiction, would it be hard to diagnose them as being bipolar?
It is hard. It's not impossible. But can I elaborate about
Please.
his notes? So I reviewed and I asked for any records, any psychological records pertaining to Mr. Gregg's mental health. And the only thing I got were the 3 records from Dr. Hardy. And there was some mention of his bipolar disorder in some of the therapy notes, like I believe LPC Kirk's, but that was secondhand, that had been given to her from Ashley. The only ones I could see to confirm, supposedly confirm, is from a Dr. Hardy. And so as an emergency doctor, as a psychiatrist, anytime a patient is brought to me, whether they're in the ER or whether they're in the state hospital, I do my best to go back and review these diagnoses, because I do not like to just simply accept them, because it is common for people to be misdiagnosed with some mental illnesses, especially if they abuse substances heavily, which, according to my review, Mr. Kevin Gregg was well known for his substance abuse, and for many years, and I talk about that in my report if you want me to go into that.
Sure.
So, let me see if I can. So I started from the beginning. There's tweets from Mr. Kevin Gregg that start in 2012. Oh, 15. So there's text tweets from Mr. Kevin Gregg on March 6, 2012. DMT, psilocybin, lysergic acid, diethylamide 25, that's LSD. Mescaline, which comes from the peyote cactus, I believe. It's a hallucinogen. MDMA, which is ecstasy. Good when used responsibly. Salvia, opium, coca, which are like plant, natural things that you can make opium and cocaine out of. Good naturals. He says that in 2012. And then he continues on. I mean, there's like 50 or almost 50 tweets. He tweets at Obama, legalize marijuana. You're ignoring this huge campaign because there's no funding. Bomb the Middle East with cannabis. They'll think they'll want to fight or eat. And he goes on. Ashley, in her journal that I read, it has 334 entries in it, approximately, that I read through. Ashley, she wrote in her journal of 334 entries a lot about her problems, issues with Kevin. And she basically described him as, to paraphrase, abused a lot of drugs, had a lot of mood lability, up and down, substances, and he was an awful father to Carly. He was verbally, emotionally, and even occasionally physically abusive to Carly and Ashley. I believe there's one incident she talks about in there where Carly had a black eye from her, and it was assumed it was from Kevin. Kevin's parents had mentioned his temper and were real kind of awkward around her after the incident related to it. But it goes on to talk about Kevin wants pain medicines. Janet will get pain medicine and give it to him. It just goes on and on and on about that.
I want to talk a little bit about bipolar because it's my understanding that that's one of the diagnoses that Dr. Clark gave to Carly Gregg. Can you talk about whether or not you believe that Carly Gregg actually has either bipolar 1 or bipolar 2?
Okay. Yes, I can. Can I finish my thought about
yes,
the dad,
yes,
Kevin? There's
yes.
one more important thing, and I'll drop it. When I was talking to Carly during the evaluation about her biological father, Kevin Gregg, I mentioned benzodiazepines. I was talking about drug use. Did she have? Can we talk about that? And I mentioned benzodiazepines, and she said she knows what benzodiazepines are. And I said, okay. And she explained, I know what benzos are. My dad took them. My dad had this drug cabinet. It was this cabinet full of drugs, like he had prescription pills from like everybody. Again, then I went on, I said, and I'm on page 12. I said, talking about LSD and hallucinogens and mushrooms, I brought those up. She said, again, that's my dad. He took all of that, but I did not. He once bragged to me about taking 10 caps of dried mushrooms, which apparently is a lot because most people only take 2, I think, because that's what he once told me. And so it was emphasized from everybody, Ashley's journal, Carly, and then as I was even watching the body cam footage, I think it's of Deputy Zetterholm, some of the other family, Ashley's parents, I think Bob and Vicky, were there talking to the officer, the deputy, and had mentioned Kevin and started talking about some of his drug use. I think he mentioned marijuana in the video. And so it seemed by all accounts, going back as far as 2012, with his tweets saying this stuff, family describing him as this, and Ashley even mentioned that he would get Janet to give him pills. To me, it made the diagnosis very skeptical of Mr. Gregg to have bipolar disorder. The very limited and sparse records from Dr. Hardy made it very questionable. And then lastly, Dr. Hardy, who supposedly are the records that support this diagnosis, saw him 3 times, totaling at 1 hour, and he ultimately prescribed, along with other things, Adderall, Ambien, and Klonopin, which are 3 highly addictive, highly abused neurostimulator and neurosedatives, to a person that, by all accounts, everybody knows him as somebody who habitually uses drugs. And to me, prescribing 3 controlled substances to a known person who uses drugs is not what a responsible physician would do if they knew the truth about an individual's substance abuse. And lastly, if you have bipolar disorder, I would hesitate to put you on Adderall, because if anything's going to push you into maybe a manic state or a hypomanic state in bipolar 2, Adderall is a lot more likely to do it than an SSRI.
So I want to talk to you about the bipolar diagnosis, and then we'll come back to a SSRI, which nurse practitioner Lieber told us a little bit about this morning. So the bipolar, Dr. Clark testified that Carly had these desolate, I believe, I don't recall his exact word for using that, but very specific times of mania, kind of discrete, thank you. Some ups and downs, discrete periods of ups and downs. In the medical world, what does that mean?
So the DSM-5-TR has specific criteria for bipolar disorder. What makes that? We all have a mood. Let's say this is neutral. And there's a zone that is considered normal variation, where we can go up, we can have a good day, we can have a bad day. We can have a good day, we can have a bad day. People with depression, unipolar, that's one pole. Bipolar means there's two poles. They're opposite ends. Unipolar depression, they have the downs, and it goes below that normal area, way down here, where they start to have depressed mood, loss of interest. We call it anhedonia. They don't enjoy the things they used to enjoy. Maybe feelings of guilt, hopelessness, worthlessness, concentration difficulties, appetite issues, psychomotor slowing, which is like a sloth. Like they don't want to get out of bed. They don't go shower. They don't bathe. They don't brush their teeth. They're so depressed. They don't cut their toenails. I could tell you some stories. Or they go the other end. They're manic and they have too much energy. They are restless. They have pressured thoughts. Their thoughts are racing. They may start one task, but they can't finish it. They may be very easily distractible. Little noises, things will distract them. They may have a grandiose view of themselves. They may have flight of ideas, so their ideas are bouncing all around. It's really hard for them to go A, B, C, D, E. There can be activity increase where they don't want to sit still. They're restless. They're moving around. There can be sleep disturbances, and there can be very talkative, pressured speech. And so those are the differences. You have the unipolar depression, you're down here, or in bipolar, you not only have the depressive periods, but you have the manic periods. In bipolar 1, you have mania. It's the most severe form. It can be so severe that you even develop psychotic symptoms. So you're so manic, pressured speech, racing thoughts, restlessness, not sleeping. And interestingly, these patients who don't sleep, they feel great. They may have only gotten 1 or 2 hours of sleep last night, but they feel really good. They're not tired after that. And so you oscillate between these two periods. For bipolar 1, mania, really high, it's 7 days of a persistently elevated mood. All day, every day, to the point that it interferes with you socially, occupationally, or interpersonally. It is obvious to people around you, and it is causing significant troubles for you, one way or another. But you feel great. You're not sleeping, racing thoughts, pressured speech. That's 7 days for bipolar 1. Then you go down, you will oscillate. Eventually you'll come down, and you may be depressed for 2 weeks or 2 months. It doesn't know. And then you'll come back at some point, you'll have another manic episode, and you'll go up and down, up and down. That's bipolar 1. Bipolar 2 is called hypomania. It's a little less than mania. I've seen patients and treated patients who have this, and they can live pretty functional lives. I can remember specific patients that they had more energy, a little bit more talkative than usual, wasn't sleeping as much. They'd had periods of depression, and they qualified for bipolar 2. But they were functional individuals. They were not. It wasn't to the point where they're psychotic, usually, from my experience, at least in hypomania. And you can live a pretty good life, and especially if you're put on medications, can help you. Typically a mood stabilizer.
So Dr. Clark diagnosed Carly as being bipolar 2. Do you agree with that diagnosis based off your evaluation and the review of all of her medical records?
No, I do not.
And why is that?
Well, politely and respectfully to Dr. Clark, providers can review different things and we can draw different conclusions. Looking at our reports, my sources are about 8 pages long. I stopped once I got to about 100 because I couldn't keep listing my sources that I reviewed. It was exhaustive. And when I looked at his report, it doesn't, at least that he wrote, I didn't see that he reviewed that much. And so I suspect that we came to different conclusions because we may have reviewed different material. My opinion is that, based on reading his report, that some of his opinion of diagnosing Carly with bipolar disorder was that he took Dr. Hardy's notes for face value. And when I read Dr. Hardy's records, importantly, he never said, Kevin has bipolar disorder and I reviewed the records from his recent hospitalization, or he has bipolar disorder because he met these criteria. He essentially just says he has bipolar disorder and he used to drink and maybe do a little bit of drugs, but doesn't do any of that now. And so I really, only having 3 visits for 1 hour with no collateral records, minimizing his substance abuse, and then prescribing him the controlled substances he did, he never said, Kevin has bipolar disorder and I reviewed the records from his recent hospitalization, or he has bipolar disorder because he met these criteria. He essentially just says he has bipolar disorder and he used to drink and maybe do a little bit of drugs, but doesn't do any of that now. And so I really, only having 3 visits for 1 hour with no collateral records, minimizing his substance abuse, and then prescribing him the controlled substances he did, I just wonder, did he have all the facts? And if Kevin doesn't legitimately have bipolar disorder, well then Carly, it's a lot less likely that she would. And then I go back and I look at Annette Bryant's records from 2015 through 2019 when she's young. There was no mention of manic episodes or hypomania. Then I look at LPC Kirk's records from January through March. There was no mention of hypomania or mania. Then I look at nurse practitioner Lieber's medical records, and there's no mention of hypomania. And then I looked at the UMMC records with the well child visit, and there was no mention. And so, given all of that, and given the fact that Carly acknowledged using marijuana, and there's discussion of when that started, text message conversations between her and, I think, Thad, he talks, it's not a text message, I think it's a really, really long Snapchat message. I mean, the Snapchat message was this long. It was pages and pages of a Snapchat. So he talks about, thank God, she stopped using marijuana, all these substances. He mentions that around Christmas. So she would have been doing it at that time. So long story short, given all of that, I highly doubt and do not believe that Carly has bipolar disorder.
I want to walk you through the second diagnosis that Dr. Clark gave to Carly. Was based on her, it says, several year history of auditory hallucinations occurring quite frequently. Dr. Pickett, I want to know, in your review of the records, was there anything to indicate before Carly was arrested on March the 19th, 2024, that there were any auditory hallucinations?
I believe in her journal, she did write one time about the voices, as I spoke to earlier, about hearing them ravenously, and thank physical confrontation was not realistic. So yes, she did mention it there. I was highly skeptical of that because it seems more theatrical and making light of something that, as I've seen patients who really suffer from this, they are haunted by it. It is torturous to them, and they do not describe it as quite silly, and they do not trivialize it.
You were present in the courtroom when Dr. Gugliano testified earlier, right?
Yes.
And she said it was actually quite rare for someone. Carly had reported hearing these voices all the way back to 5 or 6 years old, and it was quite rare for a child that young to experience voices. Is that your opinion as well?
Yes, it is.
And what about the fact that she was claiming that she started hearing these voices every single day from a young 5 or 6 years old?
From my experience, talking with patients who have schizophrenia and have auditory hallucinations, they're not usually continuous all day, every day. They're usually here and there, occasionally they're command. At one point during my evaluation, I did not write this in my report, but it's somewhere in the audio, I'm sure. She talks about, we're talking about the voices, and she was asked, I hope it's on the audio, it may have been during a break, but I do remember she said, I think Attorney Todd asked her, did you listen to that voice? And she said, no, it's a voice in your head, you don't listen to that. And I couldn't find it, but I remember it now. It was there, and that to me says, when I see people who have schizophrenia and they're disorganized, and they hear these voices, you're more likely to do what they say if you recognize the voice, if it's like, yes, my dead grandmother, and you trust the voice, and you've been hearing it for a long time, then you might actually listen to it. But interestingly, when we were talking during that, she said, no, it's a voice in your head, you don't listen to that. And I thought, that makes sense.
I want to take just a little step back to the bipolar. Dr. Pickett, we talked about that there were no periods of 7 days or more for bipolar 1 mania. And I believe the testimony is that for hypomania, you're looking at like a 4-day period. Was there anything that was provided to you, either through Carly's evaluation or prior medical history, that showed that she had had a 4-day period of hypomania?
Not that I could definitively find in anybody's medical records. And what she described to me more on the day of the evaluation was up and down throughout the day, and that it was highly susceptible or related to whatever was going on in her life at that time. It was highly related to her circumstances. At one point, I think when I'm asking her this, I'm kind of pushing her, I'm kind of probing, like, all right, now tell me more about that, and I can find it in my report if I can, but I asked her that, and she kind of gave me all the answers. At one point she said, like, it could be minutes, it could be hours, it could be days, it could be weeks, which sometimes people will do if they don't know the right answer. If I'm asking them, or they're not legitimately having them, they will give me all the answers as if they're hedging, and so I'm skeptical of that. But ultimately, I mean, it was a 4.5 hour interview, so I mean, evaluation. So she's kind of said it different ways at different times. The main theme that I picked up from her was that it was up and down within one day, like a roller coaster, and highly susceptible to what was going on around her, which is not consistent with bipolar disorder.
And I believe we heard testimony earlier that she had been diagnosed with more something akin to like situational responses, and that's why she was given a depression diagnosis.
Yeah. My understanding from reviewing their records is even Annette Bryant, the first therapist that saw her, mentioned anxiety and adjustment disorder. So she was acknowledged that she's anxious and she's having trouble adjusting to something, her life circumstances. And then I think LPC Kirk also said adjustment disorder with mixed anxiety and depressed mood. And then I think nurse practitioner Lieber said adjustment disorder, and she said single episode of a major depressive episode.
Indicating that this was not a manic or hypermanic situation.
No, if anything, it would have been the opposite. She would have been depressed and down on that spectrum, not up.
Dr. Clark also diagnosed Carly with a other specified feeding or eating disorder. I don't know that that would have much relevance in insanity, but have you ever seen where an eating disorder calls someone to commit murder?
No, I have not.
And without diving into it too far, I mean, there were notes in the records where Carly had either binged or restricted her eating at some point.
Yeah. I think even we talked about, I believe, that I know Ashley, certainly Carly told me that Ashley had issues with food and would purge. I believe that I've heard that Carly may have at some point purged. I can't remember who told me that or whether that's true or not, but I think, like her mother, there were some issues with food and restriction of that. I didn't think it particularly pertinent to sanity. I didn't necessarily dive into that in depth. And my thoughts were, if she's taking a medicine and she's vomiting, if anything, it's going to be less medication in her system, not more. Depending on when she vomits and when she takes the pill, but it's not going to be more medicine in her system. So I didn't put a whole lot of weight on it.
So you brought up medicine, Dr. Pickett. I want to talk about that now. And we mentioned the SSRIs earlier. It's been the testimony that Carly was, back in January, put on 25 milligrams of Zoloft. And that she didn't feel like it was doing anything, and then was up to 50 milligrams of Zoloft. Is that what you found to be true in the medical records you reviewed?
Yes.
And then we heard from nurse practitioner Olivia Lieber this morning that she told Carly, I want you to kind of taper off the Zoloft while also taking the Lexapro. Based off your evaluation with Carly and Dr. Clark's evaluation, is that what Carly did with the medication?
No, according to what she told me, no. I think I was told that she stopped the Zoloft cold turkey abruptly on the 12th, the same day she was prescribed the Lexapro, and she started the Lexapro, 5 milligrams.
And is Lexapro, we heard earlier that Zoloft is an SSRI. Can you tell us again what that SSRI stands for?
Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor.
Is Lexapro also a SSRI?
Yes, it is.
And so that would affect serotonin levels of the brain.
Yes. That process takes time, though. Typically, you would expect 4 to 6 weeks before you see symptoms. According to UpToDate, which is a worldwide database, it is the doctor's Bible if there is one. It's backed by multi-million-dollar clinical trials, pharmaceutical trials. It is one of, I like it, and I depend on it a lot. It says 2 weeks. Maybe you might see something at 2 weeks. And if I can I get into Lexapro?
Yes, please.
Okay.
And I'm sorry, before you do that, Dr. Pickett, 2 weeks. Do you mean it would take 2 weeks for side effects to show up, or it takes 2 weeks for the medication to kind of get in your system?
So side effects can happen more quickly than the benefits. I tell patients that all the time. I'll say, look, I'll give you this SSRI, and you may have experienced some side effects before we get to the benefits, but you got to recognize that that's going to happen, because serotonin is not just in your brain, it's also in your gut. So a lot of times there's GI symptoms, upset stomach, diarrhea. It's involved in sex, and so there's, decreased libido, difficulty having an orgasm, things like that. I don't know how pertinent that is, but anyways, the side effects can come before. Typically, it's not drastic side effects that make you lose your mind or become psychotic, but it's, headache, diarrhea, sexual side effects, typically with SSRIs. As far as the Lexapro, so according to UpToDate, the typical dose for an adolescent between 12 and 17 years old is 10 milligrams. That's the starting dose. Maximum dose is 20 milligrams. She was started on 5 milligrams, which is half of the starting dose. And if she was prescribed it on the 12th, and the offense happened on the 19th, that'd be 7 days. Depending on when she was taking her prescription would depend on, did she get 6 or 7 doses. Without getting too technical here, what's called pharmacokinetics, it gets into how, when you take a medicine, it doesn't just go in your stomach and 100% of it gets put into your body instantly. It takes time to kind of build up in your system. And so depending on what's called the half-life of a medication, which I looked it up for Lexapro, is 19 hours. It takes 5 half-lives of a medication to get up to about 99% in your bloodstream. So 19-hour half-life times 5 doses would be about 4 days. So it would have taken about 4 days for the 5 milligrams, which is half of the starting dose, to get up to 100% in her bloodstream at that. And then the bioavailability. So is another thing of any drug you take, bioavailability. How much of it is available to your biological system? I looked it up for Lexapro, it's 80%. So even when you take this pill, it goes into your stomach, it gets absorbed through the GI tract, it goes through the liver through what's called first pass phenomenon, and your liver tries to say, what is this? And try to decontaminate it kind of thing if it's a toxin. So about 80% gets absorbed. So if she was on 5 milligrams, which is half the starting dose, it would have taken 4 days to reach her steady state. I think she would have only had 6 or 7 doses in her system. And it was prescribed at 5 milligrams, but because of the bioavailability only being 80%, she probably would have been getting about 4 milligrams. Either way, even if we say it was the 5 milligrams, that's still a quarter of the maximum dose. And if somebody was going to be pushed into a drug-induced hypomania, and again, people in hypomania still can appreciate right and wrong from my experience, it would have been more likely to have happened if she had stayed on the Zoloft. If she had been on Zoloft plus Lexapro, there would have been more SSRI in her system. And if she was purging, there's even less. So it's a very low dose, a very short amount of time. I do not believe she has bipolar disorder, and so it really does not make sense to me that such a low dose pushed her into a state where she could not appreciate the nature, understand the nature, quality, and wrongfulness of her actions. And then when I got into the footage that I watched myself and the text messages, those affirmed my belief.
And I do want to talk about the footage and the text messages. I wanted to cover everything that Dr. Clark gave his testimony about first. I believe he stated that he could not relate Carly's use of Lexapro to have caused her to commit these crimes. Would you agree with Lexapro did not cause her to commit murder?
Yeah, I agree with that.
He stated that Carly was in active psychosis at the time of the crime. And I'm assuming that meant some combination of these things. What's your opinion on whether she was in active psychosis?
I did not believe she was in psychosis at the time of the offense. Based on my review of the video, her actions, these text messages, and before, how she was reported to have been before, and how I observed her to be based on video footage afterwards. Psychosis, in my experience, it does not just turn on and off. Mania, hypomania, does not just turn on and off. If a patient comes to the state hospital and they're committed there and they're manic, which is worse than hypomania, it doesn't just turn off. And psychosis doesn't either. They will be delusional, disorganized in their thinking, and very illogical until we start them on a medication that can help. And maybe it helps. It doesn't always. Sometimes it doesn't, even though we try.
So now I want to talk about, he diagnosed Carly as having disassociation. And we heard from Dr. Clark kind of what his explanation of that is, but I want you to please educate me on kind of what disassociation means.
So disassociation, and I'm not the nation's leading expert on dissociation. I am a board certified psychiatrist and we get trained in it. I do not see it a whole lot in my practice. It is relatively rare from my understanding. I think the literature is relatively sparse on it. I think we're realizing that it's more common than we thought, and there's more growing literature on it, but it's still not a widely accepted common explanation for violence. Especially, it can be associated with violence, and I read one of the articles that Dr. Clark had mentioned, and in that report it talks about that.
I think that's on page 50.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, that's on the SSRI.
I'm not sure if that's the article. Let me see. It would take me a minute to find it.
You'll look back. I apologize, actually, because that one was about the SSRIs.
Yeah, that one's SSRIs and violence, if I can.
Your diagnosis regarding the possibility of dissociation starts on page 52 of your report.
Gotcha, thank you. While I was on the subject of the SSRIs and violence, some of the literature actually suggests that it's lower levels of serotonin that are commonly associated with aggressive behaviors. And they go into animal studies with monkeys and how it's the lower levels of serotonin that are more associated with violence. And then as far as the dissociation, I believe the literature talks about, yes, there can be violence, but my understanding is it's not a specific violence. Like if you're in a dissociative state and you can't control yourself, you may accidentally hurt an unintended target. You're cleaning your gun and you have a dissociative spell and there's somebody in the house and you accidentally pull the trigger and it shoots them in the leg. Maybe. Unlikely? Maybe. It's possible. But having a dissociative spell and then doing a lot of specific things, going and retrieving a gun or an item, an object from a specific location that requires memory, hand-eye coordination, going to get that's, in my opinion, inconsistent with a dissociative spell. Yes, if you're in a dissociative spell, you may accidentally, unintentionally hurt a random person. But I do not believe there's a lot of literature out there that supports you have a dissociative spell and you go and hunt down a particular target. I just don't believe that.
Oh, sorry, Dr. Pickett, I didn't mean to cut you off.
I wanted to continue on a little bit about the dissociation if I can, or you
yes,
can.
Yes, please.
So when I was considering the dissociative spell, one of the books that I was using to read and talk about is on page 53, The Principles and Practice of Forensic Psychiatry, 2nd edition. It says, quote, on page 643, it says, quote, malingered amnesia is also frequently is also seen frequently in forensic settings, as well as being the arguably most common manifestation of malingering in specific clinical situations such as homicide. And the literature goes on to talk about how we as providers have an obligation to consider malingering when there's a huge secondary gain of having decreased culpability by being able to blame it on that. And so I took all of that into consideration. Continuing on, as when I was considering the dissociative stuff, Carly never mentioned these spells to any of her providers over decades. You know, her trauma that she experienced. So the DSM talks about this, the DSM-5-TR talks about this. The chapters related to trauma, PTSD, stuff like that, and dissociative disorders are put right next to each other intentionally to show their relationship. In my understanding, at a basic level, there are some dissociative disorders that you dissociate uncontrollably, with no prompt, with no stimuli. Dissociative identity disorder, which used to be called multiple personality disorder, the dissociative fugue that Dr. Clark talked about, where these patients will just randomly and in a very general, unintentional way get up and travel somewhere. But it's random. It's disorganized. They don't know where they're going. They're not in control of their faculties. They just end up in Dallas, Texas, and who am I? Where am I? Where's my credit cards? You know, it's an unintentional thing. And so, as I was looking through this, Carly never mentioned it to any of her previous providers. Ashley, who was very involved, never mentioned it. She did mention some zoning out, I believe, and Heath did call me, and we did not get out of this, but he did say she had some periods of kind of forgetting things, having to use a calendar to remember some things, which was unusual what he said. Also, voluntary intoxication. If she's smoking marijuana to, I don't know how often, at some point, I think she even may have drank Germ-X per like one of her colleagues that said that. I don't know if that's true or just hearsay. But if there was some substances that she may have been abusing, it's hard to say, was that related to substances, which she acknowledges the marijuana, or was that a real dissociative spell?
And Dr. Pickett, I'm sorry to interrupt you. There was actually a point where Carly related either in her journal or to a provider that she had smoked marijuana on the 16th of March, and she had something come over her body that she had never felt before. Do you remember seeing that?
I don't recall seeing that. I may
Okay.
have missed it. I did want to say, I remember my thought, is that none of the dissociative spells, because trauma and dissociative spells are so closely related, she saw Annette Bryant monthly for years, from 2015 to 2019, when she was really young. And that was closer to the proximate trauma, the abuse from her dad, the death of her sister prematurely. And so I would have expected, if she were legitimately having dissociative spells, I would have expected them to have been closer to the proximate trauma. Doesn't necessarily have to be, but typically I would have expected that. Also, dissociative spells I've never experienced one, but from the few people that I've talked to that say they have, they're not pleasant, and they're scary, and you're not in control of your body. I just find it very hard to believe that an adolescent who was experiencing these, that was so close to her mother, who was very involved in her life, would not have mentioned it. That's hard for me to believe. And then, lastly, the malingering and the secondary gain, just the convenience of, I don't remember anything from when I took the dogs out to when I woke up in the sewer. But, in block is what it's called, in block dissociative spells, where it's a big finite period, those are rare. As Dr. Clark said, the patchy dissociation is more common. And so to say that you don't remember anything from these periods, given all of this, is just really hard for me to believe.
You were here yesterday when Dr. Clark testified, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And I think he talked about that that it's more common, that it's patchy, and Ms. Todd kind of attempted to clear that up, and he was saying that still wouldn't change, even if she remembered certain things, that wouldn't change his diagnosis. But Carly had reported to him in his evaluation that she was having, and I don't think flashbacks is the right word, but that she was hearing gunshots in her dreams, that she was having, she told Dr. Giuliano that she was queasy thinking about the incident. Is that in line with somebody who does not remember an event happening?
If she were having patchy amnesia, I could say maybe. But if you're reporting in block amnesia from a period, I would find it very hard to believe that you have those symptoms related to an incident that you don't remember.
I want to ask this too. This may seem like a silly question. You've used the word malingering a couple times. For somebody that's not a psychiatrist or even in the medical field, is malingering just kind of faking?
In very basic terms, they're similar. It's deceptive. It's lying for a secondary gain. You have a reason. Maybe, you have a reason to lie, and you do. Or you exaggerate your symptoms for a secondary gain. That's what malingering is.
And in this case, you consider that Carly, now talking about these dissociative spells, is in fact her malingering because she has a secondary gain.
In my opinion, that's a very high probability, yes.
And Dr. Clark actually testified yesterday that there are times, quite frequently, that people that commit the crime of murder claim that they were in a dissociative state because they have huge secondary gains.
Yeah. According to some of the literature I quoted, yes, that's very common. It's one of the most common.
I want to talk a little bit more about this dissociation. We know from all the testimony of her providers and the medical records that there was no history of this noted in any of her records prior to March 19. Did Carly report to you that she had had any additional spells of dissociation after March 19?
Yes, while we were talking, I cited in my report the time. I asked her, I said, have any of these spells, and I'm paraphrasing, have any of these spells where you do not remember things or dissociative spells, have any of those happened since the incident? And she said, yes, actually I'm having one right now as we were doing the evaluation. And that was a 4.5 hour evaluation in which I did many tests that tested her intelligence and ability to complete tasks and recall and spatial awareness and language and all these things. And she said that she was having one then, and she also said, well, back Tuesday in court I had one, and Attorney Todd agreed with her and said, yes, I could see it on your face. And so when I asked Carly about these spells, she said they happened every time her mother yelled at her. But she did say that she seemed to remember those incidents, was my impression, and yet this one she said she did not remember it. That's my understanding from talking with her. And so it was very inconsistent. And there's one thing I do think is important. I think we need to distinguish between zoning out and inattention, which happens to all of us, and dissociative spells. As I was saying earlier, there's some disorders that you legitimately have where you don't have control over it and you dissociate. And what you do during that period, we can talk about and discuss. But there's disorders that it happens sporadically, and then there's kind of peri-traumatic dissociative spells. And what Carly seemed to be describing to me were peri-traumatic dissociative spells. When her mother would yell at her, she would dissociate because that triggered her. That's a trauma in her eyes. The DSM-5 TR talks about, gives examples of a prisoner of war who's being tortured, and their body cannot take it anymore, and so their brain essentially hits, for lack of a better word, the ejection button. And the brain says, I cannot take this anymore. I'm under so much stress. I'm out here. And it dissociates. Or another example that the DSM-5 TR gives is human sex trafficking. Somebody who's being repeatedly raped over and over. Their bodies cannot take the trauma that they are experiencing anymore, and their brain hits the ejection button, which, to my knowledge, the brain does not do this half-heartedly. It leaves the body in a very vulnerable state, being dissociated. You are vulnerable to everything around you. If you cannot control your body, you're vulnerable to predators, attack, anything. The brain, it doesn't make sense that the brain would do this half-heartedly. Again, there are disorders where it happens sporadically and you cannot control them. Dissociative identity disorder, the dissociative fugue, the dissociative amnesia, but the peri-traumatic dissociative spells, to my understanding, you are being traumatized and therefore your brain hits the ejection button. But you do not dissociate and then go traumatize other people, is my understanding. And that's from my training, my research, things that I've read about this, preparing, and the articles, and my training and knowledge and experience, and seeing patients.
Dr. Pickett, I want to put you to page 31 of your report quickly when you were talking about your conversation with Carly regarding her dissociative spells. Was there a time that she actually said, like, she called it derealization?
I believe so, yes.
And what is that a medical term?
Yes, it is.
In treating any of your other patients, have they ever used the term, I was derealized?
No.
Do they call it themselves before getting a diagnosis, I disassociated?
No.
And prior to your evaluation with Carly, she actually had not received any diagnoses of dissociation. Isn't that true?
Correct.
But in fact, the defense told you that was going to be their argument for insanity, right?
Yes.
Tell me about
one avenue.
Tell me about that, because that was on the day of your evaluation before, I think 5 or 6 days before we got their expert report.
Can you clarify exactly which part so I make sure I'm following you?
Yeah, so in your interview, you asked about making sure that you kind of covered all the right things. You kind of wanted to know what is it, why is it that you're claiming Carly was insane?
Yeah, I do remember that. At one point, and it is on the audio, you can hear, I think Carly may have stepped away just to go to the bathroom, and I asked Attorney Todd, I said, hey, I want to make sure I cover the right stuff. Can you tell me, can you clarify exactly what, as far as insanity? And she said that, I think she said the medications worsened an underlying unrecognized diagnosis. And I said, okay, all right, I'm just making sure I'm following. And that was, I think Dr. Clark had done his evaluation the day before.
And do you recall what Carly said as she walked back into the room for the evaluation?
I cannot remember.
Would it refresh your memory? She said something about, like, what mental condition do I have?
I'd have to listen to the audio. I can't remember.
But to that point, she had not been diagnosed by any physician or psychiatrist with disassociation.
Not that I was able to find in reviewing the medical records, psychiatric records.
When you asked Carly to describe the events of March the 19th, How did she describe her mom's demeanor when she found out about the vape pens and the burner phones?
I think, if my memory serves me correctly, she described her as frustrated, and they didn't talk on the ride home. That she was upset, and her mom searched her backpack, and they didn't talk on the ride home, and that was it.
So Carly acknowledged that mom was very upset about finding out these things. So you asked Carly to describe for you kind of what she could remember from that day, March the 19th, 2024. If you would, walk us through what she told you.
I remember her telling me that she hadn't slept well the night before, went to school that morning, was irritable, cussed out a friend, went through the rest of her day. I believe she was doing okay. And then she went to, I remember her explaining that she remembered going from her room, down the hall, up the stairs, and to her mother's room. And then when she got there...
And to be clear, I'm sorry to interrupt you, she's talking about at the school still,
At the
right?
school, yes, because her mother was a teacher. And after that, it seemed like, according to what I've gathered, that her mother was upset and searched her backpack. They drove home. They did not talk, and they were upset.
And then did Carly tell you she remembers letting the dogs outside?
Yep. She told me that she remembers letting the dogs out, and then she doesn't remember anything from then until when she awoke in the sewer.
And when you asked her about the sewer, do you recall her saying, "I knew I did something wrong because I wouldn't have been running away"?
I remember her saying something along the lines of that she said that she did something wrong to the police officer because it seemed like the logical thing to do, was kind of how she described it.
And then she said something to the effect of, when he asked her if you're the girl that shot, she said, yeah. And that's what she's talking about, because it was the logical thing to do.
I believe so, yes.
In your audio recording, you're talking to her about that time, about after she came out of the sewer, and when we know to be Tony Shack, we watched the video of that yesterday, takes her into custody. And she said something to the effect of, "I thought Heath was dead." Do you remember her saying that?
I remember watching the police, the deputy's audio, his video camera, and she asked about Heath, and then the officer, the deputy, mentioned the mother, but then yesterday in his testimony he said it wasn't the mother, it was just Heath. And that's that.
What, if anything, do you remember about Carly describing for you seeing Bennett and his mom on the scene?
Yes, I believe in my audio it talks about how she was worried. She remembers seeing Bennett and Bennett's mother and was worried that they would hate her.
And did she tell you why she thought they would hate her at that moment?
She didn't elaborate that. I had my presumptions, but I did not force her to say why.
Because based upon what she told you, she only remembered letting the dogs out and coming to in the sewer, right?
Right.
So they'd be mad at her about something to do with letting the dogs out?
I don't know.
Dr. Pickett, I want to talk to you a little more about your opinion regarding the McNaughton standard in this case, right? So we, unfortunately, people had to see these videos where Carly goes into a room, we hear 3 gunshots, and then she comes out. I want you to walk me through the reasons that you believe that she had specific intent to commit these crimes and that she knew right from wrong at the time.
Okay. Well, backing up a little bit, just knowing the context from what I was told, or from what I gathered from reviewing Discovery, was that Bennett and a friend were really concerned about her substance abuse. That's what I saw in text messages with Discovery, reading that. So they approached her mom, and Carly went there after school. They rode home but did not talk. This is per Carly. She was frustrated. Ashley was frustrated, per Carly. And then when they get home, I start in the garage video footage. I see Carly, what looks like she kind of jerks the door open, looks frustrated. Then they go inside, and they're at the kitchen. They put everything down, and they make eye contact, and Carly looks her in the eyes and kind of rolls her neck like this, which is kind of, to me, seems like a tense situation. They're not talking. And then Ashley goes straight to Carly's side of the house, presumably Carly's room. So knowing the context, seeing that, it seems like a tense situation where Ashley being as involved, and her, according to Carly, one of her greatest fears was that Carly would one day turn into her dad, who constantly used substances and had a lot of mood lability. And so Mom, Ashley, seems to go straight to Carly's room, or Carly's side of the house. I don't know that it was her room. And Carly can be seen on the Wise video footage kind of moving back and forth, touching her face, touching her hair. Seems a little frustrated, anxious. And so I go through all that video, I watch it, and then after Carly walks back in the house. So at one point you see in the video, Carly takes the dogs out. Ashley comes back. She kind of looks through the window. At one point she has what looks like a little black cylinder-shaped small object in her hand. I don't know what it is. I presume, based on the context and knowing what about it, that it is maybe a vape pen. I don't know for sure. And so then Ashley goes back towards, I think, her room, and then Carly's room or area, side of the house. Carly comes in the house, and at this time Ashley is on Carly's side of the house. Carly kind of comes up to the entryway. She's leaning forward. She's got both of her hands, not in fists, I don't want to say fists, but down by her side. She's leaning forward. She pauses as if she's thinking something, and then slowly turns towards her room. And then she quickly, briskly walks directly across the screen from Carly's side of the house to Ashley's side of the house. So given the context and seeing her walk so briskly, seemingly purposefully, directly to where the object is that could kill her mother or kill somebody, to me shows an intact memory, it shows an intact motor function, it shows coordination, and it suggests a specific intent. She did not walk to the kitchen and grab a banana. She did not walk in a disorganized state of mind. She did not walk to the living room and grab a remote control in a confused, dissociative spell. She walked directly to where the sole object that could kill her mother was, and she retrieved it. To me, that says that this person shows a very specific intent on what they plan to do, and that suggests that she understands the nature and the quality of what she's about to do. That's why she went specifically to where the gun was, not to the kitchen or to anywhere else. Continuing on, and it gets even more convincing to me as I watch the video, At 16, 14, 15 on that video, she peeks around the corner and she's hiding something, concealing something behind her back. To me, this shows a spatial awareness. So Ashley could have moved. Ashley could have moved to the kitchen. You've got to look around and see, because if that person has moved, your intended target has moved, you don't want to just walk straight across to your room with this object. They could intervene. They could see you. They could stop you. Instead, in a very methodical manner, she peeks around the corner with the object behind her back. To me, that shows spatial awareness. And these are high functioning executive skills that your brain has to, different areas, the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, all of these different areas of the brain have to do this for you to do such intricate things. This was done, in my opinion, as a forensic psychiatrist reviewing this video, to locate the intended victim, to ensure Ashley had not moved so that she could not intervene, and so that she could, and she did it in a very, just her head around the corner, hiding the object. That suggests, that's almost predatory in my opinion. That is looking, that is intentional, that's not accidental, that's not dissociative, that's not psychotic. Then when after she does that, she clears the kitchen, she sidesteps with the object still behind her back, and this object is still directly where the WISE camera cannot see it. And it's an awkward sidestep, and I wouldn't expect somebody to do that unless they were intentionally trying to conceal or avoid detection from the surveillance camera. And that to me suggests strongly that she appreciated the nature, quality, and wrongfulness of what she was doing at that time. Then she goes into her side of the house, I presume her room, and we hear the gunshots. And then we hear some screams. And as I know from reviewing the autopsy pictures, there were at least 2 shots in Ashley's head. That takes that marksmanship of landing those shots on a relatively small target, that if you shoot it once, I presume with gravity and whatnot, it might move. So to stay on it and shoot it again shows a high level of brain functioning. Motor centers, the cerebellum with coordination, the occipital lobe with the visual centers. This is a high level of functioning. So then, continuing on, then Carly comes, a little time passes, Carly comes into the dining area and she gets Ashley's phone. I believe it's Ashley's phone from what I've been told. And there's a passcode on it, and she unlocks it, which that, to me, shows that she has some degree of intact memory, hand-eye coordination, and that this was calculated and specific. You have to type in a specific code to unlock the phone. It's not a disorganized, unintentional, random numbers. It's a specific code. And then she texts Heath, her stepfather, which is a specific target. It's not a disorganized, confused, psychotic, random numbers. It's Heath's phone that she dials. And then she texts him and says, "You almost home, comma, honey, question mark." In my report, I used some very strong language just to describe this one aspect. I used the word diabolical. And I stand by that word. I do not believe Carly is a diabolical person. I do not believe she's an evil person. I believe all of us have the potential for good and evil, and in us, it's human nature. As a psychiatrist, I study human nature. Anger, lust, greed. These are things I study. And so we all have the potential to do that. But when Carly on that day went and unlocked the phone, texted a specific target, her stepfather, who she told me was more of a father figure to her than Kevin was, and said, "When are you almost home, honey?" Using that honey is an enduring term. I might use it for my family, a loved one. I wouldn't use it for a stranger. When she did that, to me, that was very specific and diabolical. And that, to me, is not consistent with a dissociative spell. That is not consistent with psychosis. That is not consistent with mania. And it's definitely not consistent with hypomania. To me, that was deceitful. And so the fact that she did it from Ashley's phone instead of her own phone, I asked myself, why would she do that? If I don't know the norms of their family, I don't know if it's normal for Carly to text Heath and say, "Hey, when are you going to be home?" That might have, if that's not normal, that might have been a warning, or like, something wrong? Why are you texting me? Why are you texting me when I'm going to be home? So to me, the fact that she did it from Ashley's phone, posing as her mother who's in the other room dead or dying, really suggests a specific intent, that she understood the nature, the quality of what she was doing, and I would suggest even the wrongfulness by, she didn't use her own phone because she didn't want to raise alarm, in my opinion. Then, at one point in that video, right about that same time, she lets out this like hymn. Look, the camera's right there. She knows the camera's there. She sidestepped earlier with the gun behind her back, which tells me she is aware that that camera is there. When she came back into the dining room, she had something behind her back that she laid on the stool. She kept it on the stool behind her. At one point, the dog walks behind her. She kind of looks behind to make sure there's not going to fall off in front of the camera. So all of that suggests to me that she was very aware of the camera. And I think that she was trying to, for lack of better words, play cool. And just, she's interested in music. She plays the guitar. She plays the mandolin. She built a mandolin with her grandfather. She's a musical person. And I think she naturally let out this hymn as almost a play cool. I know the camera's on me. But it was not disorganized. It was not in some weird, disorganized fashion. It was not weird language. It was not a demonic voice. It was not. It was a short hymn. And I think she was trying to play cool. And I think it, to me, that was callous. And so I also think it was related to some nervous adrenaline. Like she's very, and she lets out this hymn. Continuing on, as I watched the video, at one point she goes back, after that, she goes back to her room, or her side of the house. I don't know, there was room. And the dogs are in the dining room and they make some noise. And she yells out, "Heath, Heath, Heath." That was a very specific name. That was not a disorganized name. It was not a random stranger. It was not in some strange voice. It was very controlled. Not like a pressured mania, disorganized, or psychotic and disorganized. To me, that shows that she knew exactly who was going to come home. It was not disorganized. It was not illogical. It was logical. And I believe after that, she recognized the dogs keep making noise. I've got to go. I got to get rid of them because I don't know if Heath's coming home. Heath, 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 is that you? Because she is in the room with her dead mother. That to me suggests that she strongly understood the nature and the quality of what she was doing at that time. That's why she called out his name. That's why she let the dogs out, because they were making noise. She doesn't know, is that the dogs making that noise or is that Heath coming in? So she lets the dogs out. And this conveniently puts her right beside the camera footage that then turns off and is later found hidden behind some water bottles in the refrigerator. I presume it's hidden. There were water bottles and it was behind it in the corner. To me, that strongly suggests somebody who's trying to hide evidence and avoid detection because they appreciated the wrongfulness of what they were doing. A psychotic person who's disorganized and doesn't know who they are or what just happened or where they're at, I do not believe would put the camera, take it down and put it in the refrigerator behind water bottles. This also, when she came back out, gives her a second opportunity in front of the camera to play cool. And she said to the dog, she kind of whistles and she says to the dogs, "It's okay, it's okay." And I have dogs myself, and I thought, why would I tell my dogs it's okay unless it wasn't okay? Unless even seemingly the dogs might have appreciated that it wasn't okay. I'm not a dog psychiatrist, but some things seem to transcend species. And at this point I saw the dogs were down, their ears were down, they were running around, and she lets them out, and she even comforts them and says, "It's okay, it's okay," and whistles. And to me, that was kind of self-incriminating. It's a small thing, but a guilty conscience. If you're aware of what you've done, you might try and comfort the dogs and say, "It's okay, it's okay." Then, so that's from the video footage. Then I get into the text messages. Do you want me to continue on?
Yes, please.
So with S.K. Riley, she texts and says, Carly says, "I need help," which tells me she understood the situation to some degree. Then she capitalizes it, emphasizing, "I need help," which tells me she's serious. She knows, she understands the nature and the quality of what just happened. Then she replies, "I can't tell you," which again tells me she understood the wrongfulness. Because why couldn't she tell one of her best friends unless she couldn't tell her because she understood that it was wrong? And then she said, I'm not going to KMS. That stands for kill myself or anything. She even appreciated that her friend was concerned that she was going to harm herself. And she recognized that and was able to tell her friend and comfort her friend, I'm not going to kill myself. That showed me a awareness of her situation and even an appreciation of her friend's concern. Continuing on, she referenced, "I'm glad you met Raymond." So I found out through discovery and things and talking, and that Raymond, I believe, is a boyfriend of Sarah's or a friend or a lover or something. And she references this Raymond. And S.K. Riley even thanked her for that. To me, if you're in a dissociative spell where you are so out of your mind and so psychotic that you don't understand the nature, quality of what you're doing, I find it very hard to believe that you would be able to recall a relationship that your friend has with somebody and reference that to them.
Your Honor, maybe approach for just a second.
Yes.
Dr. Pickett, other than the Sarah Kate Rayleigh text messages, were there other messages that indicated to you, because the jury has heard some of those messages from Sarah Catherine Rayleigh and Bennett Germany, were there other messages or other things that you relied upon in determining that she did in fact know right from wrong on that day?
There's other text messages. There's one with Bennett and there's one with Thad. And then there's also some things from Brooks' statement that I read that were, but see, that's her statement, but these are actually Carly's words at the time. And so I think they're important because to me, they speak volumes about her understanding of the nature and the quality at the time. So I know those witnesses have spoken, but the text messages do speak to her understanding of the nature and the quality of what was going on.
And included in some of those messages, I think Sarah Catherine read out something to the effect of, last message was, "I'll tell you tomorrow if I see you." Did you consider that one?
Yeah. That to me suggested that she had a more than an understanding, even an appreciation that there might be some consequences coming my way for this, and I may not see you tomorrow.
And similarly, when she told Thad, excuse my language, I've fucked up. I mean, that would indicate that she knew that she had done something wrong.
In my opinion, yes.
She was able to tell Bennett what her address was and where she was. Is that your understanding of the text messages between them as well?
Yes, which I did not believe that would be consistent with a dissociative spell or somebody who was disorganized or psychotic or even having a dissociative amnesia, that they would be able to recall their address and state it in a text message, which again requires the language centers of the brain, the visual centers, the hand-eye coordination, and the recall memory to do that.
And then I believe that you referenced in your report some of the messages with Thad, and the jury's had the benefit of hearing him testify, but he actually offered to call 911, and at some point she tells him, no, you can't do that.
Yeah. To me, that would strongly suggest that she understood the nature and quality of what happened, and that she understood the wrongfulness, because if he were to call 911 and paramedics show up, then she would be seen with a dead body there. And
I want to talk about Brooks' statement just a little bit regarding Carly's shooting and attempting to kill Heath. What particularly about Brooks' statement led you to believe that Carly knew right from wrong and had specific intent for that crime?
yes, I will answer. I do want to clarify that the video footage and the text messages, that's all my opinion off of my observations of all this. When we get into Brooks' statements, that is my opinion based on somebody else's statement. So it has to be taken with a grain of salt there. But if what Brooks says is true, suppose reportedly, per her statement, Carly asked her, "Are you squeamish around dead bodies?" Which certainly, if that is true, suggests that Carly understood at the time the nature and the quality of what she had done, and even that somebody else may have different feelings about it, which shows a higher level of appreciation, that I can not only know my feelings, but I can understand how you might feel. And then, do you want me to continue on as far as
Yes,
Brooks?
please.
Reportedly, if what Brooks says is true, Carly assured Brooke not to worry about the cameras, that they had already been taken care of. And so that would suggest to me that Carly appreciated, understood the wrongfulness of her, what she had done, and therefore was trying to avoid detection.
And then she also made some comment to Brooke about, I put 3 in my mom and I got 3 more waiting for my stepdad when he gets home.
Yeah. If that is true, that would strongly suggest that Carly, at the time of the offense, understood the nature, quality, and wrongfulness of what she had done.
I want to back up just a little bit to Dr. Clark's diagnoses of Carly. I diagnosed her as being bipolar, schizophrenic tendencies, disassociation, and eating disorder. So we've gone through, Dr. Pickett, how you, other than the eating disorder, you do not agree with his diagnoses. But for argument's sake, let's say that all of his diagnoses are proper. That,
Okay.
that Carly did suffer from bipolar, some form or symptoms of a schizophrenic-like situation and possibly a disassociation. That does not mean that she is insane, correct?
Correct. As I was explaining earlier, having a threshold diagnosis is just your ticket to even consider insanity. Without a diagnosis, you cannot even consider the other prongs of the standard. You have to have that just to even be considered. That in and of itself does not equal insanity, in my opinion, from what I know based on the state standard. I have, from experience, I have patients who have schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, and they know when we talk, hey, all right, you're going home soon, you know you don't need to do this or that, you take your meds, they know right from wrong. Just because they have the diagnosis does not mean they're insane. I do have my diagnoses.
Yes, I was about to ask you if you could tell the ladies and gentlemen kind of what you diagnosed Carly with, and then kind of your overall conclusion regarding those diagnoses and how that might have affected her on that day.
Yes. So based on record review, she was diagnosed with adjustment disorder with mixed anxiety and depressed mood and a single major depressive episode. I agree with those based on the records and what I've reviewed at the time. I think those were reasonable. I also, in addition, felt like she met criteria for generalized anxiety disorder, which includes according to the DSM-5-TR, excessive anxiety or worry occurring more days than not for at least 6 months. The individual finds it difficult to control, and they have at least 3 of the following symptoms: restlessness or feeling keyed up or on edge. So they're antsy, they're on edge, they feel restless. Being easily fatigued, I did not think that one applied. Difficulty concentrating or mind going blank. I feel like that could apply to her zoning out. Her irritability, it says, muscle tension and sleep disturbances. And then it says, these cannot be better attributed to a substance or another mental disorder. So for generalized anxiety disorder, she seemed on edge. That's one of the reasons she explained to me that she smoked marijuana, was if she was going to have if she couldn't sleep at night, or if she was going to have a bad day that day, she didn't want to have a nervous breakdown at school, she might smoke marijuana to help with her anxiety and nervousness. The mind going blank, that may explain her zoning out. In psychiatry, we kind of try to find diagnoses that explain most of the symptoms, and the generalized anxiety disorder is pervasive. I mean, it goes back to when she was a child talking with Annette Bryant about adjustment and anxiety and the issues she was having with her dad. So on edge, hence she used marijuana, mind going blank, the zoning out spells, irritability, and the sleep disturbances. All of those are included in generalized anxiety disorder. So I felt like, based on the DSM-5-TR, she met criteria for that, and it would explain a lot of her symptoms. Also, cluster B traits. So people are typically hesitant to diagnose a personality disorder in an adolescent, because the brain is still developing, there's hormones involved, and it can be stigmatizing, and it takes time to really get to know that person. They have to have a pervasive pattern. I looked through years and years and years of records, decade of record, back to 2011, so 2011 to 2024, so yeah, over a decade. I felt like that gave me the ability to look at things over a long period of time. Again, I'm not going to diagnose her with a personality disorder, but she does show some emerging cluster B traits. In personality disorders, which are common, there's different clusters. They get grouped together based on different things. She shows some what's called cluster B, which includes borderline personality, antisocial personality, narcissistic personality, and histrionic personality. I think her narcissistic personality shows, especially when she talks to her therapist about, I get tired of these students who they sleep through this good teaching, and it's in a derogatory tone. When she talked about this voice that's condescending towards other people, it did not come across to me as a legitimate auditory hallucination, but more so maybe some narcissistic traits and condescension towards others. In her journal, she talks about, well, when you read this one day, maybe I'll, make the nuclear bomb. Not that I plan to, but she saw herself as this child genius that she described in her, based on her school records, which I agree with. She might be. You'd need intellectual testing to formally prove that, but her grades certainly suggest that she's very talented and gifted. But the cluster B traits, the most important one is the borderline. So borderline personality and bipolar disorder commonly get confused. Commonly. This, because both of them have the mood lability, the ups, the downs, the ups, the downs. Both of them have that, but they have a different cadence. And bipolar disorder, like I said earlier, bipolar 1, 7 days, bipolar 2, 4 days, and then depressed for 2 weeks. Importantly, in borderline personality, your mood lability can be minute to minute, hour to hour, and it's often related to the circumstances around you, and it's often seen in people some of these personality disorders are often seen in people who have experienced childhood trauma. Borderline personality disorder also traits shows cutting or self-harm. Relationships are also usually very intense with your friends. I love them. I can't live without them. And in her journal, she does talk about couldn't go a day without them. Some of her friends. I'm so lucky to have them. There's also some devaluation. There's idolization and devaluation in your relationship. So one person you idolize, one person you can't stand. As a clinician, a provider, I often see this where they'll say, Dr. Pickett, you're the best doctor that I've ever seen. You're the only doctor who ever listens to me. But then they'll go see another doctor, or they'll come see me and I'll say, Dr. Pickett, you're the worst doctor. I hate you. I can't stand you. But this other doctor, he's the only doctor. So there's idolization. And with Carly, I believe there may have been some idolization of Ashley and devaluation of Kevin. Then borderline personality also deals with abandonment. Now, when I asked Carly about abandonment, whether that was an issue, she did not make it a big deal. But the way she describes her friendships, I would be skeptical if one of her friends were to abandon her, how she would take that. Would she start cutting more? A lot of patients will trade emotional pain for physical pain. So they'll cut. It's not an attempt to kill themselves, but it's an exchange. And so borderline traits, again, even though she has, and rage, anger, difficulty controlling your anger is another characteristic of a borderline personality. And so their relationships are often up and down, hot and cold, rocky. They can have trouble with their rage. And that was the last theme when I reviewed Dr. LPC Kirk's notes, was they had talked about anger as a secondary emotion, how to appropriately manage that. That was the day before. And so, generalized anxiety disorder, which can explain a lot of her nervousness, the restlessness, the zoning out, the sleep disturbances, and anxiety is a overwhelming theme throughout all of her, most of her psychiatric records. The borderline personality disorder is much more consistent with traits. I'm not going to label an adolescent with a disorder. And the DSM-5 says, the DSM-5 TR says, all of the traits can become present as early as 12 to 13 years old. They can be present. So even though I'm reluctant, the DSM-5 TR recognizes that you can call them out, you can address them when you see them in unusual cases, which I think this is. Then I also said some psychopathic traits. And I don't use that word lightly, especially in an adolescent. But as I was reviewing her journal, where she says it's okay to be evil, when I see the callous nature in which she left her dead mother to text her next intended victim, and then even used the word honey, that is callous. And it is very concerning to me. In her journal, she often talked about There were violent themes. I think she may have some, with her friends, as I was reviewing Discovery, there's memes about violence. There's often this mix of fantasy, dark humor, and violence. I've seen a lot of memes. I won't go into them, but the callousness of which she did that, she has this superficial charm. She's charming. She's very likable. I liked her when I did the interview. I don't like saying any of these things, but I truly believe them. And so she's very charming. Manipulation. She took extensive notes about how to manipulate, and I have somewhere in here, and I can find it, it's 85 pages of some manipulative behaviors that I document. Okay, here we are. I can find that if we really need to. I'm happy
That's
to
right,
find it.
Dr. Pickett. I mean, based off of the evidence that you reviewed and her journals and sketchbooks,
Yeah.
and the interviews with the other children, family, and friends, you determined that she exhibited some manipulative behavior.
I did. Real quickly, and I'll move on, I thought there was a lack of remorse. I think she has shown some remorse now.
Your Honor, may we approach?
Yes. Tell you what, ladies and y'all hold on. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we've been going for a little while. I'm going to let y'all go ahead and take your afternoon restroom break. Okay? All right, record reflect, we're outside the presence of the jury. You have to approach. I'll hear any objection.
Do you want us to come?
You can object from there.
Both, I just wanted to make people aware that both SK's parents and BG's parents have texted me during this witness's exam to say that their children's names are being used and
I didn't associate their children with this case. I've done everything I can do to prevent their names from being used. But at some point, the law does not prohibit the witnesses from using their names. That's not the law.
No, Your Honor, but it was in your court order that it wasn't to be put on the media.
I think the media is doing their best with this. They're doing their best. I mean, the most important people in this case that everybody seems to have forgotten in this room is the jury. So we're going to take a 15-minute break and both sides take a pregnant pause and think about the jury. Last question was, that's all right, Dr. Pickett, based off the evidence that you reviewed, her journals and scratchbooks and interview with other children, family, and friends, you determined that she exhibited some manipulative behavior.
Thank you.
Next question.
Dr. Pickett, we were discussing the diagnoses that you had rendered about Carly, and we left off, you were talking about manipulative behavior. Were there any other diagnoses that you attributed to Carly?
Yes. I didn't finish my thoughts on the psychopathic traits. There's a few other characters I'd like to just say real quickly.
Sure.
About the manipulative behavior. I found one example. There's others, but I thought, her journal that talked about the emotional manipulation and the happy hurting, I thought that was, concerning. She describes herself in the journal as melodramatic, and she asked herself at one point, am I just pretending just so my friends will feel obligated to comfort and care for me? About her emotional state, I thought that was manipulative. I thought about the fact that she didn't tell some of her, like LPC Kirk, about some of her marijuana use and such. I thought that was hiding and manipulative. And then when we were talking, sometimes she kind of de-emphasized certain things, and I kind of felt like I was being, pushed, not pushed towards a certain diagnosis, or I thought it was manipulative. So that's where I got that. Another psychopathic trait is like poor behavioral control. So I looked through a lot of things. I mean, obviously, the incident is a poor behavioral control, and doing the there's other things. The knife incident with the school, where she initially said it was for somebody told her to. She told me that a friend told her to bring it, but then after reviewing the discovery, it said that she had told them it was for protection, and mentioned some high school students. And then some promiscuous sexual behavior. There was a sex toy found at the scene. There was the nipple piercings. And so I'm certainly not diagnosing a 15-year-old as a psychopath. I'm just saying there are some concerning traits. And given me trying to rationalize why did this happen, that played a factor to some degree. And then lastly, I agreed with some other specified trauma and stress-related disorder, like an adjustment disorder with prolonged duration of more than 6 months without prolonged duration of the stressor, which basically adjustment disorder, which is a type of trauma-related disorder.
And considering all of those diagnoses, what was your final conclusion? We talked about it kind of in the beginning. I want to come back to it. Your final conclusion about whether or not Carly meets the standard of McNaughton and Sane in the state of Mississippi.
So all of those diagnoses gets me to consider McNaughton. So she's got the ticket, she meets the threshold to consider it. So I considered it, but her actions, for which I observed on the video and reading on the text messages and reading all the discovery and understanding what seems to be the context, in my opinion, her actions strongly demonstrate that she understood the nature, quality, and wrongfulness of her actions on that day. And therefore, in my opinion, the ultimate decision is for the fact finders, but my opinion is that she does not meet Mississippi's standard for insanity.
And is that opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty?
Yes, it is.
Attorney Witness, Your Honor.
Cross.
Thank you, Your Honor.
If I may beg the court's indulgence for just a second to get organized, Your Honor.
Yes.
Good afternoon, Dr. Pickett, or may it please court.
Yes.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I have a few questions for you, I guess, regarding your report and everything that you've just testified.
Yes, sir.
First of all, I know you're a forensic psychiatrist, and I know you're, I think you're qualified in emergency room technique, or as an emergency room doctor, as a psychiatrist and as a forensic psychiatrist.
Yes, sir.
My understanding is, when did you become a psychiatrist? I guess when you become a forensic, or when I say psychiatrist, a forensic psychiatrist, that's when you become board certified? Is that sort of, or do you just take the classes and then you get board certified?
So you complete your psychiatry residency first. You graduate from that. You get a degree that you're a psychiatrist, but at that time you're just a general psychiatrist. You still have to take whatever state boards to be licensed. Then you apply for a fellowship. It's a very competitive process. You get selected, and then you are a fellow. You're not on your own, but you are seeing forensic related cases under the supervision of your supervisor.
And when did you become, become an official board certified forensic psychologist or psychiatrist?
So I graduated from my fellowship in forensic psychiatry in June of 2023, and then I believe I took my boards around September. No, what was that? Yeah. That would have been September 2023 when I got my board certification. But you're doing forensic cases, that would have started in July of 2022.
Okay, so you've been doing forensic cases since July of 22, which is approximately 2 years.
Approximately, yes, sir.
Okay, and you actually became board certified in, I guess you said October?
I'm estimating September of 2023.
Okay, so it'd be about a year from now, right around about a year. Okay.
Approximately, since I was board certified, yes, sir.
Okay, and you don't have a specialty in child or adolescent psychiatry, correct?
No, sir.
Okay. And wouldn't you agree that anytime you're dealing with kids, adolescents, there's little nuances and differences in those situations, correct?
I think there's certainly subtle, little, as you said, little nuances. But as a general psychiatrist, we do have experience with pediatric and adolescents. We do at least a year in our residency of exclusively child and adolescent. So we do get trained on it in residency. And as a general psychiatrist, you commonly can see whatever age you feel comfortable with. You don't have to be board certified to see it, is what I'm trying to say.
Not saying you don't. I guess my question is, I'm sort of getting into, there's an actual, I guess, board certification, which is for children and adolescents.
Yes, sir.
And so how many more years of school would you have to go to get to that point?
That's 2 years, I believe.
Okay. And that sort of, you get all the specialties and everything, so you know the nuances and how everything works. Is that correct?
I think they have more training in it. I agree with that.
And Dr. Clark, who you watched testify yesterday, he's board certified in children and adolescent psychiatry, correct?
According to what he said, yes, sir.
Yes. And are you doubting what Dr. Clark said about his qualifications?
No.
Okay. So he would have more, I guess, training and stuff in as far as, I guess, with children and adolescents, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And he's also, I think, been practicing for, I think it was 25 or 30 years, correct?
I think that's what he said, yes, sir.
And so he would have a lot more experience than you do, because you're, I guess, where you're at for forensic psychiatry just started about a year ago. Would that be correct?
What part of that are you asking is correct? That my training was just a year ago, or that he has a lot more experience than me?
He has a lot more experience than you.
Yeah. Yes,
Okay.
sir.
And in fact, he's even taught psychiatry, correct?
That's what he said.
Okay. Now, Les, I want to go through this. It seems like, have you ever heard of the term confirmational bias?
To some degree, yeah.
Okay. And isn't it true that what confirmational bias is you get something in your head and then you go out and you start trying to prove it, as opposed to figuring out what the big picture is, you sort of narrow it down and you try to get a specific result. Would that be correct?
Yeah, I think that would be the definition of confirmation bias.
Now, do we have a little bit of confirmational bias in this situation?
Honestly, I do not believe so. I told the prosecutors that I'm going to be as objective as I can, but once I start reviewing discovery and learning about this case, depending on what those point me to, will determine my opinion. And once my opinion falls on the side, then I'm going to, advocate my opinion.
Well, there's some things that I guess where and I'm not going to go through everything as far as your report and everything, because I'm not a psychiatrist, and you know a whole lot more about psychiatry than I can ever ask you questions about. But you would agree with me, Dr. Clark testified that he had diagnoses that were very different from the ones that you had today.
Yes, sir.
And you would also agree that Dr. Clark has a lot more experience, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, there's some things that I wanted to go over, because you talked about, I guess, that there wasn't really anything that could be used that would lead you to believe that she was suffering from, I guess what Dr. Clark called wasn't delusional. What was it? What did he term it? What was her condition?
He said many things.
Yeah, wasn't it dissociative or something? What was it? What was he saying that she was suffering from?
I don't want to speak for Dr. Clark, but I believe he was saying something along the line.
Disassociation, maybe?
Yeah.
Okay, is that what he was saying, that she was in a state of disassociation?
I think he said that.
Okay. And so you don't believe that, well, one, let me back up. You said you're not really familiar with that, correct?
I said I'm not the nation's leading expert on it, but we get trained on it in residency. I've read about it in the DSM-5 TR. I've read various articles about it preparing for this. So.
Have you had people that have been under this affliction before?
Very few.
Very few. And it's not something that's common.
It's not.
And I think something that's important is you said this is a very unusual case. This is a rare case. Wouldn't you agree on that?
I think it's unusual for a 15-year-old to shoot and kill their mother. And it's unusual in that aspect. It is not unusual as far as the psychiatric diagnoses and mental health based on review of her records, in my opinion. That's actually very common.
So the situation is very unusual. You don't see this very often. And the fact pattern is really unusual in this, isn't it?
Can you elaborate a little bit on what you mean by fact pattern?
Did you ever see any violent tendencies at any time? Were you able, in your, I guess, review of everything, were you able to see any violent tendencies that she had? And I'm talking about Carly.
I'm simply trying to recall some of the journal entries. Some of them had negative themes, that I would say, and they idolized characters who were violent. And so did she have some predilection towards that, or based on her personal journal? Yes, but did I see any from her? No, I did not.
And the journal was what that you saw that she talked about movies, different things like that. That's what that led you to believe that she has violent tendencies.
In her journals, she talks about happy hurting with her emotional manipulation. She talks about she really liked the Pinocchio movie, and her favorite parts were when the bomb dropped on the church that killed Carlo and Mussolini, and she referred to that she might one day be famous for making a nuclear bomb. Not that she had in plans to do that, and it's okay to be evil, and she chooses fire because it is powerful, beautiful, and deadly. So no, I did not see her do violent acts from the offense, but I did see a theme of concerning things, and many of them had violent themes.
And that's it. That what you just read off, that was it.
I do not believe that's it. That's what I could find as a needle in a haystack of an 85-page report, but there were themes of that.
Now, you said, you brought this up, and you said life's greatest, what is it, illusion is innocence?
Mm-hmm.
And you made a big deal of that, right? And you said that you thought that was, I don't say inappropriate, but her putting it in her journal caused you concern.
To some degree, yes, especially given the context of where we're at now.
Do you know where that comes from? It comes from a video game. That's it. It's a video game. It's called Skyrim.
Yeah.
No clue, did you? You had no clue that that's where it's coming from. Did you think she made it up?
I am familiar with the game Skyrim as a gamer myself. Her screen name was Lazy Assassin. That was her online screen name too.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to talk about video games and violence and Skyrim. And Skyrim is an adult game, and there are some things in there that I don't think are appropriate for a 14-year-old, but that's just my personal opinion.
Mm-hmm. And kids play that all the time, and I agree with you, there's probably things that are inappropriate. But that's the game. Did you not recognize it?
No.
Now, there's also, I think you would agree with me, that there's a lot of, in her journal, there's a lot of, I guess, quotes from songs or lyrics from songs and things like that. And that's all pretty benign, correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, the one thing, and this is where I get into this confrontational bias a little bit, every time there's something that points to a different position or sort of what Dr. Clark brings up, you say you're discounting the journal, that where she says that she's hearing voices and all this kind of stuff, and she's hearing voices before this incident. You're like, I'm going to discount that. That doesn't really count. But then you turn around and want to use stuff like this and say, yeah, I'm taking these little statements, and it's violent tendencies. So why is it that you're sort of, how you say, cherry picking the different parts of it that suit you?
I would have to disagree with that. I bring up a few highlights that are concerning to me, but also in my report I mentioned that in her sketchbook she has some sketches of little ponies. That wouldn't support that she's violent. That's included in my report. And also, some of the journal stuff is inconsistent in that she mentions, feeling numb and things like that in January in her journal, but then come February, she tells that to the nurse practitioner and they attribute it to her Zoloft. And so some of the things in her journal, are conflicting with what I'm hearing from other sources. So I don't put a whole lot into it. I'm certainly not basing my decision about her insanity on those things. But to even consider insanity, you have to have the prerequisite threshold diagnosis. And therefore, I did a deep dive into an adolescent's journal. But that was only one piece.
Now, the biggest thing that you said led you to believe that, caused you concern was that you were not seeing, I guess, any reporting from either of the two. I guess it's Kirk and the other therapist, and that caused you some concern because you were saying that normally, individuals are going to confide in that person. Would you agree?
Generally, most people would confide in their mental health professional about things that they were concerned about regarding their mental health.
Yeah. Now, we had some testimony from one of the therapists today, and she said that it had taken her, I guess, a year and a half before Carly had opened up about issues. And I think with these people that she started seeing in January, that would have only been about 3 months of seeing people, correct? So there wasn't a lot of history with therapists between, I guess, when she went in January 15th to when the incident happened. Would you agree on that?
I agree that there was only those two within that period, but there are older records from a therapist that were also reviewed in my report.
And she wasn't having these issues back then, or correct?
No, and that was actually closer to the traumatic event.
Now, are you sure that's the traumatic event? Because that's one of the things you go to the traumatic event. You can have other things that cause you to have a traumatic event, correct?
You can.
Yeah. So when you're saying that there's a traumatic event in her life and it's whatever happened, it's 5 years ago, we really don't even know if that's what it was, correct?
We don't, but by talking to her and asking about her history, it does seem like when she's talking that was a significant trauma. The Kevin, the neglect, the abuse, and her sister dying at a young age, and her parents divorcing. Those were big, and she hasn't mentioned anything bigger than that to me, or that I have seen in the records.
Now, she was diagnosed with, I guess it would be a major, psychological issue in January. Was that correct?
I believe LPC Kirk diagnosed her with adjustment disorder, with mixed anxiety and depressed mood, and the mental health nurse practitioner Lieber agreed with that, also diagnosed her with adjustment disorder and said that she met criteria for a single episode of major depressive disorder.
Yes, and medication was prescribed, correct?
Yes, sir.
And it was never discontinued, correct?
No, sir.
And when we're saying discontinued, I'm not trying to, play loose and fast with my question. It is, she's continued to have medication to this day since January of January of this year until currently, as far as you know, correct?
I know she had it up until the incident. I have heard some of the things that she's been on in jail or being detained. I don't know the specifics of all that.
Now, in jail, she was diagnosed with a psychological disorder and treated with high doses of antipsychotics, correct?
I would say it's a moderate dose. I think it's 10 of Abilify, Dr. Clark said. I mean, when I'm at the state hospital, now these are adults, I do go up much higher doses, 20 milligrams even, maybe even 30 at times. So 10 milligrams, adolescent, seems moderate. One of the current is, I believe she was on Celexa in jail. So Celexa, that one's a little concerning to me because Lexapro and Celexa has Lexapro in it, essentially, in a very basic term. Citalopram is two mirror images, the R citalopram and the S citalopram. They're mirror images. It gets into biochemistry, blah, blah, blah. But it has both in it. The Lexapro is just the S citalopram portion. So to me, if you're really concerned that the medication was causing some issues, having her on citalopram, Celexa, which is still Lexapro, doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. Now, the Abilify, we use that for many things. And that could explain some of the,
Well, and this is one thing. Dr. Clark had explained it yesterday. And he said that, yeah, your Celexa has the Lexapro, but it has the other, whatever the other qualities. And it affects the brain a little bit different. So some people that don't do well on Lexapro do well in Celexa. Would you agree on that?
I would recommend if somebody had reportedly a bad experience on Lexapro, then you shouldn't use the SSRI that is as close as possible to it and literally contains the same medicine. I think that would be a bad idea.
And so again, that's where you differ with Dr. Clark.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Let's talk about, I think you were talking about Dr. Hardy's evaluation of Kevin Gregg.
Yes, sir.
And that's a person you have never, ever seen. You have seen 3 pages of, was it medical records I think you testified to?
Yes, sir.
And you're wanting to basically say that the doctor that has seen him is wrong on his diagnosis, that actually saw him. I know you said it was only for a few hours according to the records. 1 hour for the records that you saw.
Total for all 3 visits was 1 hour.
And so you're saying that he got it wrong, and you don't know if there's even more medical records, do you?
I've asked for the other medical records. I wanted the other medical records because I really wanted to confirm or deny whether Mr. Kevin Gregg actually legitimately has one of these mental disorders or whether it's just substance abuse.
So the way I got it and the way your testimony was, and maybe I could be wrong, but it seemed like you were saying you don't want to say, or you, first of all, we were dealing with bipolar, and evidently there's a heredity issue with bipolar.
Yes, sir.
And so you were wanting to say that Kevin Gregg really doesn't have bipolar, therefore the heredity part of the prong that would go towards Carly doesn't exist.
I would say yes, if he doesn't legitimately have bipolar disorder, then it makes it less likely that Carly has it.
And so your reasoning is that you want to make another diagnosis over a doctor that actually saw the individual and diagnosed them with bipolar.
I don't want to, but as my job entails, I have to look at the details. And people are misdiagnosed frequently. I know this because I work at the state hospital and these patients come to me and reportedly they have a diagnosis of this or that, and we kind of go through their history and we're like, no, it actually seems more consistent with this. So it is standard to question previous doctors on their records, especially when they're so sparse, especially when there's a big history of drug abuse that can make you look manic, that can make you look psychotic. I wouldn't be doing my job if I just accepted any piece of paper that says somebody has a diagnosis.
So even though there is a diagnosis, a valid diagnosis from a doctor, and you don't have anything to overturn it, you're like, I'm not accepting it. It's basically my understanding.
I disagree with the diagnosis based on extensive review of Mr. Kevin Gregg per all the records, Ashley's description of him, Carly's description of him, grandparents' description of him to the deputy as I was watching the video. Anybody that knew him knew he was addicted to many substances, and he was prescribed Adderall, Klonopin, and Ambien. If I have somebody with bipolar disorder, I'm not going to prescribe them Adderall because that can really push them into a manic episode. And when I reviewed Dr. Hardy's records, he did not justify. If I have a patient that comes to me and this is our first interview, I will diagnose, say, according to the records I've reviewed, Mr. Johnny has schizophrenia because he had delusional thoughts, he had disorganized thinking, he had auditory hallucinations, and here's the records I based that off of. And Dr. Hardy did not do any of that. And actually, his substance abuse was minimized in those records. And so I just don't believe that Kevin may have been as forthcoming with Dr. Hardy, and he may not have had all the records.
Now, what is Thorazine?
It's an antipsychotic.
And that would be something that that was prescribed to Kevin Gregg by Dr. Hardy.
I don't know everything Dr. Hardy may have prescribed to him. I know the ones that were very concerning.
And you didn't see that one? You didn't see that?
I don't remember.
What about, I guess it's Respira?
Risperdal.
Yeah, what's that?
That's an antipsychotic.
Okay, that was prescribed to Kevin Gregg by Dr. Hardy, which would be consistent with what's that treating?
We use antipsychotics for behavior. So if somebody comes in and they are acting erratic, violent, aggressive, yelling, screaming, throwing fits, hurting people, we often use mood stabilizers and antipsychotics. So just because somebody's on an antipsychotic does not mean they have a psychotic illness or bipolar disorder.
Now, did you never looked at the medical records from the jail, correct?
I looked at the ones that were sent to me from Region 8, and I glanced over them. I didn't necessarily put a lot of weight on them, only because I am evaluating her sanity at the time of the offense, and what she says to people now that cannot be objectively confirmed. I can't see it and do it in myself and really see that I see this without such giant secondary gain. I'm real skeptical of those things, and so I didn't put a lot of weight into them.
Because the way I understand it is, she gets diagnosed in January with with a major situation, however you want to call it. It was a one-time kind of deal.
Yes, sir.
And then you were in here when one of the witnesses disclosed that Carly and her talked about Carly hearing voices. Remember that?
I do.
Okay. And so that happened before the situation happened on the 19th. And then you had, in the journal, it talked about hearing voices. And I think that was on the 12th of March, which was right before the situation, correct?
Well, a few things I'm skeptical about is the friend. I believe they're still friends, is what was said yesterday, and that they still communicate to some degree, and sometimes ideas can be implanted after the fact and people don't know. So I'm real skeptical of that because of the large secondary gain and the things that have been consistent with malingering. The journal article for the 12th, when I see people that have schizophrenia and they are suffering with these auditory hallucinations that they do not want, they do not like, that bother them, they usually do not describe them as quite silly, and they do not describe them as ravenously screaming at each other, and thankfully physical altercation is not fruitful. That's not how they describe it.
How would a 14-year-old describe it?
I think she would go to her mother and say, "Mom, I'm hearing voices." And the mother, especially if she was as involved as Ashley, would have taken her and made sure that the mental health providers knew about it.
Well, I think all the testimony is that she didn't want her mother to know about that, correct? Isn't that what all the testimony is?
I have heard all of the testimony. I've heard the last 2 days.
I mean, you've been for the last 2 days. I think the testimony has been, especially you heard everything that Dr. Clark said. everything was that the mother did not want to, or Carly didn't want the mother to know about her I guess, issues. Did you, I think you even talked to her in jail about this very thing, didn't you?
I never talked to her in jail. I talked to her here in the courtroom doing my evaluation.
I'm
She
sorry,
did
it's,
talk.
it's connected.
Okay, yeah. My impression was that she wanted to hide, especially some of the more negative things from her mother, the burner phone, the marijuana, talking to the boy. It's not my impression that she was trying to hide her mental health from her mom. I think her mother, from everything I could gather, was very aware of her mental health, and therefore her mother insisted on taking her to seek help.
Now, you did bring up a good point, is, and you brought it up a couple times, the individual, like clients, patients, however you want to characterize it, a lot of times they're not forthcoming with everything to people like psychiatrists, psychologists, individuals that are therapists, people like that, correct?
Yes, sir.
And I think you heard from one of her therapists today that she was having to drag stuff out, that she was almost about to, say, hey, we need to switch to another person because I'm not getting a lot of, I'm not pulling stuff out of you. I'm not helping a whole bunch. Do you remember that?
My impression was that Dr. Kirk thought that she was doing fairly well and was considering discharging her, or referring her elsewhere if necessary, but at that last visit pried her, kind of pushed to talk about the stuff with her mother, and that's when the rage and the anger came up.
Now, at one point, Carly, and this is stuff, again, put in her journal, and said that she had a psychological or psychotic break. Do you remember that part in the journal?
Yes, sir.
And you said you didn't put a lot of credence into it because it was something that she wrote, and I think you said the journal was, she was using it as sort of like theatrical and things of that nature. Is that sort of your take
Yeah,
on it?
I said there's a mixture, seems like, of what might be truth and what seems theatrical.
Now, the disassociation, which we were just talking about, you're not really, you said you know about it, but you're not an expert, and you said you have seen it in rare cases. We agreed that this was a rare case, correct? Or your words, I can't remember.
It's an unusual case in that a 14-year-old killed her mother. It's not unusual in that her mental health, as well as anxiety and depression, those are common.
And Dr. Clark had gone through and spelled out exactly how disassociation works and how it could work with her, how it was working that on the 19th, correct?
Yes, and I enjoyed the academic exercise of talking about dissociative spells, but in my opinion, what Carly did that day was not consistent with dissociative spells at all because of so much specific intent.
And just getting into the specific intent that you're talking about, if you're in the dissociative, I guess, situation, you wouldn't be knowing what you're doing with all that. You can be doing that, and I think the research shows that you can do that, correct?
I think the literature is very sparse on this. I think the literature talks, there are case reports or examples of violence being completed in a dissociative state, but again, based on my review of the video and Carly's text messages at the time, in my opinion, shows way too much intentional, high-level executive functioning to be in this unknown dissociative spell and yet do so many specific things.
Right, and it sort of goes back, you're talking about, I think what the literature says is that happens. It's rare. This is a rare case to begin with. And then you have more, I guess, rarity in a lot of the facts. So, I mean, it's possible that happened, correct?
It's in the realm of possibility.
Yes.
But I have to say that what's a lot more common and the literature supports is arguably the most commonly malingered thing is malingering amnesia, particularly after a homicide. And that's much more common than what you might be able to possibly do in a rare dissociative state.
Right, and that's where you go back in and you start looking at sort of different things that had happened, as far as you're looking in the journals, you're talking to the friends, you're seeing things like that. One thing that on the jail records that was very important was it showed that she had said that she was having hallucinations. I think more than, I think she did that in at least a couple months, and they gave her a Abilify. I think you remember that.
Were they visual or auditory hallucinations?
Auditory hallucinations, I believe. Yeah, auditory hallucinations.
That she reports.
She reports to the medical staff at the jail. They give her a Abilify, and then after a few months, it gets better.
That's all per Carly.
Yeah, but that would also be consistent that, because you can have a I guess a episode, a psychiatric episode, and it doesn't all start at one time. It builds, correct?
Cases vary. Some people, it shows subtly and then progresses. Other people may do a substance and then it causes a break or something like that. So it can vary.
It can vary, and you can, in this situation, there was stuff that was out there before this happened. And then we have the 19th of March, and that's when this situation happens. And then right on the back end is where you have, I guess, she's telling the person in jail, this is what's going on, and they prescribe her this medication, and then it gets better. Did you talk to her about that, about the hallucinations no longer being present?
I don't remember us getting into that too much. Sometimes I try not to interject or implant. I don't want to say, hey, are you having this? Are you having that? I want them to voluntarily tell me, because I don't want to implant ideas in people's heads. And so most of the time, if they're really experiencing these things, when I see my patients with schizophrenia at the hospital, they gladly tell me and eagerly tell me and beg for me to help them.
Well, you keep saying when you see your clients at the hospital who have schizophrenia, you didn't diagnose her with schizophrenia, correct?
No, sir. I'm just using schizophrenia as a standard psychotic illness.
Well, when you saw her, I guess it was on the 30th of August, not too long ago.
Yes, sir.
She's competent. She answered all your questions, all that kind of stuff. There wasn't any problems, correct?
Correct.
She's lucid. I mean, she was on the 30th. She was 100% fine.
Yes, sir.
The big question is how she was back on the 19th of March, correct? That's what you're here for.
Yes, sir.
And so right after that, there's records at the jail where she's saying she's having these hallucinations. They're giving her medications. And then it seems that works, because she no longer, I think there's some notes that she's no longer having them. So wouldn't that be something that you would want to look at?
It's not necessarily pertinent to how her mind frame was at the time that she killed her mother, especially when I have video footage of her at that time, and I have text messages of her conversations at that time. I know I have all the statements of everybody who knows her way better than me. I have medical records from years. Hearing exactly what she says afterwards when there's a big secondary gain.
Well, what about the victim in the case, her stepfather? Her stepfather describes her as, that's not Carly. That's what his testimony was. And he's the person that actually saw her. And I know you haven't said anything about that, and that would seem that would be something that's very, very important when he's saying she was not in her right mind. And that's when it's happening.
I tried to call him and interview him, and he didn't want to talk to me. But later he called me for about 6 minutes on the phone at the request of Attorney Todd, and we talked, but it was very limited to Carly's been forgetting things and zoning out. I wanted to talk to him and hear his side.
Did you not hear the testimony?
I didn't hear his. I was only here for yesterday and today's.
Okay. Because he said that, would this have any impact, is if he's saying that she did not look like she knew who Heath was.
Well, she called his name 3 times when she knew he was coming home, and she texted him and said, hey, when are you coming home? So I find it hard to believe that she didn't know who he was. Now, him being in a shocked state, looking in her eyes, if she's in a shocked state too, because she's about to shoot him or attempting, I don't know how much he could decipher accurately at that time.
So his opinion on her state and how she looked and things like that really doesn't play with you very well.
I would take it into consideration. I do not think it would change my opinion.
And I mean, I just so the jury knows, there's nothing that I can say up here when I'm asking you questions that's going to change your opinion, correct?
If you were to give me some objective evidence of things, I would certainly take that into consideration.
You wouldn't just go like what we did with Heath Smiley and just say, I don't think that he can make a good determination.
No, I've based my opinion off of the mountain of evidence that I have reviewed, my clinical evaluation of 4.5 hours with Miss Carly, reviewing all the medical records. I have based my opinion on that, and if there was new information that was relevant, I would certainly consider it.
May I beg the court's indulgence?
Yes.
I know you're a psychiatrist, forensic psychiatrist. Did you treat many kids at all?
Not as a general psychiatrist, not as a forensic psychiatrist. As an emergency physician, I frequently treat kids.
And just dealing with, I guess, your role as a forensic psychiatrist in this situation, how many evaluations on adolescents and kids have you done?
As a forensic psychiatrist?
Yes.
Probably my first.
Okay. How many times have you been qualified as an expert to come in and give opinions?
I did have to testify in another case on a patient who was bipolar, and the ex-wife was trying to say just because he has bipolar he couldn't see his kids, and I said he's doing great, he's taking his med, he could just see his kid. I was an expert in that. It wasn't, it was mental health in the legal system, so I think that would qualify, but that's my only other time.
Okay, so this is your first time in a criminal case?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And this is your first time doing an evaluation on a 14-year-old?
I'd like to clarify my last answer. This is my first time testifying in a criminal case. I have done competency evaluations and sanity evaluations for patients regarding criminal cases. I just haven't testified in those cases.
Gotcha. have you done many evaluations of children and adolescents?
No, sir.
Okay. May I beg the court's indulgence for a moment again? Okay. And this is one thing. There were two other evaluations that were done, and that's Dr. Clark and I think Giuliano.
Yeah.
Okay. Neither one of them came to the conclusion that there was malingering, correct?
Not that I recall.
Okay. We would tender, Your Honor.
Dr. Pickett, you've done more than, or close to over 100 evaluations regarding competency and insanity, isn't that right?
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Camp asked you about if Dr. Clark had more experience than you. I guess that means he's been practicing longer.
I guess.
I submit to you, there's attorneys that are quite older than I am and have practiced a lot longer than I have that have been disbarred. Does more experience always mean that you're a better doctor?
Not necessarily.
Does more experience mean that you always get the diagnoses right?
No, and I would like to just clarify quickly, even if she has all of these diagnoses, what matters is that just lets you start to consider insanity, even if she has all of them. And I'm completely wrong about all my diagnoses, and she has all the diagnoses that Dr. Clark says. In my opinion, based on reviewing the video footage, the text messages, the extensive discovery review, her actions at the time strongly suggest that she understood the nature, the quality, and the wrongfulness of what she was doing.
And just one more follow-up, Dr. Pickett, to that. Mr. Camp mentioned that when you evaluated the defendant, I think he said that she was competent and 100% fine. But she actually was claiming to you that at that very moment she was in one of these disassociated spells, right?
Yes.
No further questions, Your Honor.
State have any further witnesses?
The state does.
All right. This witness may be released by the state, correct?
Yes, sir.
By the defense.
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, you can stand down. And the state finally rests, correct?
That's correct.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, the jury, it's 5:05. I'd ask y'all to be back in the jury room 8:45 tomorrow, ready to go, okay? Everyone remain seated while the jury exits.